say rock bottom is a myth, that you can always fall deeper, or at least trip on a loose stone while you're down there and faceplant into the mud. I never believed that more than when I first laid eyes on the Wellington Grand Theater, an old building lying at the end of an unnamed highway in rural Ohio. Picture a battered shoebox someone tried to remake into a palace, only to give up halfway through. That's the Grand for you. Its brick exterior was patched with mismatched concrete in at least 3 places, and the roof sagged like it was carrying the weight of decades-old secrets. I remember stepping out of my ancient Honda, the muffler held on by no less than 4 twist ties that I'd scavenged from bread bags. The building sign read, Classics Week, $3, but half the letters had burned out years ago. Laughable, if it wasn't about to be my workplace. My name's Adrian Hale, by the way, former film student, current walking collection of regrets. I used to dream about seeing my name in bold, theatrical lettering, with crowds lining up around the block to watch my masterpiece. Life apparently found that idea hilarious, because now I was about to scan tickets at a place that smelled like a moldy sock stuffed with day-old popcorn. I needed this gig, though. Student debt doesn't care about your dreams. It just wants feeding. In fact, my entire post-college existence had been eaten up by bills. Then my best friend died last year, a friend who was basically the entire reason I kept going, brainstorming screenplays in late-night coffee shops, his laughter cutting through my self-doubt whenever a scene wasn't working. So, yeah, I took a job as a part-time usher in Nowhere, Ohio, because why not? My real ambitions were long buried in an unmarked grave somewhere behind the student loan office. Stepping inside the movie theater, the lobby was as warm and inviting as a funeral parlor that forgot to pay its heating bill. Ugly burgundy carpets, not the rich wine color they were probably meant to be, but the muddy shade of something that had seen too many spilled sodas. Popcorn machines that might have survived the Great Depression wheezed behind a counter, and the ticket booth wobbled every time someone leaned on it. Immediately my nostrils filled with that special brand of industrial popcorn butter that never, ever leaves your system once you've smelled it. Standing behind the ticket counter was Donna Harlow, the manager. She had this severe, drawn expression, like she'd personally witnessed the downfall of civilization and decided to go on managing theaters anyway. Her mouth was set in a thin line, cheeks gaunt with permanent exhaustion. "You're Adrian," she said, not quite a question. "Follow me." No hi, no welcome aboard, just that flat command. Lovely. I stumbled after her, feeling every ridge of the torn carpeting through my worn-out sneakers. She led me into the break room, which was basically a closet with a crooked table, 2 plastic chairs, and a vending machine that could have been a time machine back to 1972. "You'll find this posted here." Donna tapped a laminated sheet that took up most of the wall space. It said, Rule 1. Do not interrupt the woman in theater number 5. If you do, she may invite you into her grief, and sometimes her grief devours more than just your sympathy. 2. Unmarked reels require a witness. One soul can be too easy a meal for whatever is captured between those frames. 2 watchers might survive to tell the tale. 3. Sweep the balcony in total darkness. They see best in the light, and if you let them see you, they might decide you belong with them. 4. Never leave lobby posters up more than 7 days. A film's spirit clings to its advertisement. After a week, it might start speaking to passers-by in whispers only the desperate can hear. 5. No dream talk in the break room. Once spoken aloud, dreams seep into the walls, growing mouths, hungry for the nightmares that birthed them. 6. If the concession phone rings after 2 a.m., answer only with, "Final show is over." The caller is not from this side, and anything else you say will let it slip through to the voices on our side. "Obey these," Donna said, "or you'll regret it." Her finger lingered on the sheet, nail chipped and yellowed. I stared at her, waiting for a wink and something like, "Sorry, we like to haze new employees." But nothing came. She looked as serious as a heart attack in a hailstorm. Still, I decided that she was messing with me. "Right," I said. "Sure." Donna's eyelid twitched. "Don't be cocky, Hale. We had an incident last month. I don't have the patience to bury more staff." She said it the way you might say, "I don't have time to reorder Fanta." So matter of fact, it gave me goosebumps. Before I could press her, she pivoted on her heel and left me there, stuck between wanting to roll my eyes and feeling an irrational urge to check behind me. This place was odd, and I hadn't even started my first official shift yet. I finally drifted out into the main corridor to get my bearings. The walls were painted that old theater red, but the paint was peeling. Overhead lights flickered, not in the cool atmospheric way, but in the "we can't afford to replace these bulbs" way. The hush was total, broken only by a faint mechanical hum. A projector spool, I thought, but there was no show on the schedule for hours, and the sound was coming from somewhere behind a locked door. "Hey, new guy," a voice hissed. I spun around to see a young woman with dyed green streaks in her hair, Lucy. She introduced herself as if bracing for my scorn, but her face was kind enough, eyes too wide, like someone who'd seen things that kept her perpetually startled. "Did Donna send you on the rules tour?" She always does that. The rules. She's, serious about them. Lucy's tone was weighted, quiet. Just then, in the distance, something clanged, like someone dropped a metal bucket on concrete. Lucy jumped like she'd been shocked. Before I could ask about the rules, I caught a flicker in my peripheral vision. Theater number 5 was at the far end of the hall, door labeled closed with a handwritten sign taped over the proper placard. In the narrow window of that door, I glimpsed a female silhouette. Somebody was inside. Then, just as quickly, no one was there. A smell slid past my nose, something burnt, reminiscent of hair sizzling on a stove. I almost gagged. "What's in theater number 5? I asked Lucy. Her shoulders tensed so hard I could see them rise to her ears. "Just follow the sign," she murmured. "We keep it off limits for a reason." Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her name tag, picking at a corner that was already frayed. My curiosity sparked, but Lucy's tone convinced me not to push. The last thing I wanted was to be the doofus who got fired before the end of day 1. After that, Lucy bustled off to the concession area, leaving me alone in a hallway that felt about as welcoming as the basement of a condemned church. I told myself, "You need the money, Hale. Don't blow it." Then again, something about the hush in the walls, like faint breathing or a distant whisper, told me the money might not be worth it. The break room was where we met before the late shift. That's when I saw Ryan, another usher, who wore a perpetual tension in his jaw, as though he expected the ceiling to cave in at any second. His eyes darted to every shadow that moved, and he kept a pen clutched in his fist like he might need to stab something. Lucy was there too, uncharacteristically silent after our introduction. Then there was me, trying to look like I wasn't creeped out by the musty smell that seemed to intensify whenever the AC kicked on, a sour tang of mildew. Donna strode in like a warden doing cell checks. "We close late tonight," she said. "Ryan, you handle the sweeping. Lucy, do the final counts. Adrian, you, stand by, you'll observe." "Observe what?" I asked, but she ignored me, turning to Lucy. "Did you warn him about the incident last month?" Lucy bobbed her head like one of those dashboard dogs, eyes flicking toward me then away. She looked torn between telling me something and shutting up. "I, let him know it's important to follow the rules." "Good," Donna said curtly, running her thumb over her key ring. At that moment, Lucy tried to open up about some dream she had. "I keep seeing theater number 5 full of pale, twisted faces, and they all..." But she got no further. Right as Lucy began describing the dream, the light bulb above us exploded in a shower of sparks, glass raining down like the final flourish of a twisted magic show. Lucy squeaked, staggering back. Donna's expression turned thunderous. "What did I say about dream talk in here?" Lucy recoiled, tears forming in her eyes, then fled without another word. Ryan averted his gaze like he'd seen this scene one too many times. I blinked, shaky. What the hell was that? Donna glared at me, then at the shattered bulb overhead. "Rule number 5, she snapped, pointing to the list on the wall. "No dream talk. This place." She clenched her jaw until I heard a faint pop. "It doesn't like hearing our nightmares." Then she stomped out of the break room, leaving me with my mouth hanging open. trying to rationalize how Lucy's random mention of a dream could short-circuit a light. Faulty wiring, I told myself, but that explanation was wearing thinner by the minute. I was about to chase Lucy down when a scream from the corridor startled me so badly I nearly toppled the vending machine. Ryan lunged for the door first and I followed, heart pounding in my throat. We sprinted toward the noise, which led us down a flight of steps into the basement storage. The lights revealed old film posters curling at the edges, half-broken mannequins missing limbs, and lumps of plastic tarp covering shapes I couldn't identify. Another shriek echoed off the concrete walls. That's when we saw David, the part-time janitor, who I'd only glimpsed for about 2 seconds when I first arrived, trapped beneath a toppled metal shelf. It looked like it had been shoved over with violent force. As blood pooled around him, soaking into his pant leg and spreading across the floor in a dark puddle, David's hands clawed at the edge of the shelf, eyes bulging in terror. I grabbed one side of the shelf, Ryan grabbed the other, and we heaved, but the damn thing was jammed, like something was holding it down on purpose. David coughed, flecks of red dotting his shirt. He kept trying to say something, but it came out as a gurgle. Until, miraculously, the shelf loosened. We slid it off him, but it was too late. With blood soaking his abdomen, David's injuries looked too precise, almost as if he was sliced open by claws. As I knelt beside him, not caring that my knees hit broken glass, David's gaze snagged on me. His fingers clutched my sleeve so tight I felt them shake. Then, in a croaking whisper, he said, "I saw her. In the real." Blood bubbled on his lips, and he went rigid. I'd seen death before. My friend in that hospital bed last year, the final beep of the monitor echoing in the patient room. But this was different. This was violent, immediate, primal. I wanted to scream at David to hang on, to stay with us, but his eyes had already fixed on something far beyond the basement ceiling. He died still clutching my uniform, his blood soaking into my knees. Lucy appeared at the top of the basement steps, letting out a sharp gasp at the scene. I shot her a look that probably resembled pure horror. Saw her in the real. The words made no sense, but they felt loaded with doom. Donna showed up moments later. After assessing the situation with face like stone, she radioed for an ambulance, her voice steady, almost practiced. No tears, no meltdown, just a resigned acceptance, like this is what happens. And maybe in that bizarre, hopeless moment, I understood. She was used to it. That night, David's body was removed under the official story of a freak accident. Lucy wept, hiding her face in her hands. Ryan looked ready to pass out. I, on the other hand, was so rattled that I nearly threw up behind the dumpster outside. And through the swirling shock, I couldn't help thinking, what the hell have I signed up for? Donna told everyone to clock out early, probably to let the cops and ambulance workers handle the formalities. Though it was clear the police were taking the accident story at face value, ignoring the deeper weirdness. As I was heading toward my car, Lucy grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Wait," she said, voice quivering. I need to tell you something." Her eyes darted around the parking lot. Ryan was giving a statement to a bored-looking officer, but I noticed him shooting glances our way. "Not here," I muttered. "Too many eyes." Lucy nodded, understanding immediately. So after leading me around the corner of the building, she pulled a crumpled cigarette pack from her pocket, lit one with trembling hands, and took a deep drag. "I've worked here 8 months," she whispered. "David was the 6th person I've seen die or disappear." My stomach knotted. 6 people? And no investigation? "No. They never find enough evidence," she cut in. "Or they find too much that makes no logical sense, so they circle back to accident or ran away." She looked up at me. "You seem different from the others Donna's hired. You notice things." I wasn't sure if that was a compliment. "Why do you stay if people keep dying?" Lucy laughed. "We all have our anchors, don't we? Mine's my sister. Medical bills. She's got, well, it doesn't matter. But this place pays surprisingly well for what it is. Better than anywhere else in this ghost town." She paused. "You've got your own reason too. We all do. That's how it chooses us." "Chooses?" I frowned. "The building, you mean?" Lucy took another drag, the smoke curling around her face like a veil. You need to understand something, Adrian. This isn't just a haunted theater. There's a hunger in the walls. The rules aren't just superstitions, they're survival strategies. Donna didn't make them up. They've been here since before she was manager. I tried to process this. And the woman in theater number 5? Is she real? Lucy's face paled further. You don't want to know what's in number 5. Just know that the rules are there for a reason. Break them, and you pay. Not always right away, but eventually. I thought about David's dying words. I saw her in the reel. A chill ran down my spine. What happened to David? I asked. Really? Lucy looked around, as if the shadows themselves might be eavesdropping. He was curious. Found an old film reel in the basement while doing inventory. Unmarked, just like rule number 2 warns about. He thought the rules were bullshit, like most new hires do. She gave me a pointed look. He watched it alone. Next day, he was on edge, kept saying he could hear whispering from the projector even when it was off. 2 days later, she gestured vaguely toward the building. Well, you saw what happened. I remembered the wild terror in David's eyes, the way the shelf seemed held down by an invisible force. But what does that have to do with the woman in number 5? Lucy's face clouded. Sometimes what you see in the reels follows you out, like a stain that won't wash off. She flicked her cigarette away. I've said enough. Just follow the rules, Adrian. And if you start feeling like something's wrong, like the building is watching you, listening to your thoughts. She paused, meeting my eyes. Then it probably is. Before I could ask more, Ryan approached, his face drawn. Donna's looking for you two, he said. She wants the keys back before we leave. Lucy nodded, brushing past him. But as she walked away, Ryan caught my arm. Don't trust everything she says, he whispered. Lucy's been here too long. The place gets in your head after a while. Something in his tone made me uneasy. And you? How long have you been here? Ryan smiled. Long enough to know better than to talk about it in the open. He nodded upward. This place has ears everywhere. I followed his eyes instinctively, and at first saw nothing but the sagging roof of the Wellington Grand. But as I looked more closely, I could have sworn I saw movement in one of the high windows, a pale face pressed against the glass, watching. Despite David's traumatic death and every instinct telling me to quit, I came back the next day as if nothing had happened. I needed the money, I told myself. The day shift was weirdly normal. A handful of elderly patrons, a few teenagers cutting class. I took tickets, swept floors, refilled the ancient popcorn machine. Donna was nowhere to be seen, apparently handling paperwork in her office. Lucy was off, and Ryan worked silently at the concession stand. As the lobby emptied out, around mid-afternoon, I found myself alone, straightening the faded movie posters in their plastic frames. That's when I noticed something odd. The poster for The Shining had been up for nearly 2 weeks, according to the date scribbled in the corner. Rule number 4. Never leave lobby posters up more than 7 days. I frowned, remembering Lucy's warning about taking the rules seriously. With a glance over my shoulder to ensure I was alone, I carefully removed the poster from its frame. As I did, I noticed something strange. The paper felt warm to the touch, almost feverish. And after rolling it up, I heard something. A whisper so faint I almost missed it. Come play with us, Adrian. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The line from the movie, but personalized. I dropped the poster like it had burned me. It unrolled slightly on the floor, and I could have sworn the faces of the Grady twins on the poster had turned to stare directly at me. Shit, I breathed, backing away, only to bump into someone and nearly jumped out of my skin. Easy there, Jumpy, Ryan said, steadying me. His gaze fell to the poster on the floor. Breaking rule number 4, I see. I was taking it down, I stammered. It's been up too long. Ryan nodded, eyeing the poster warily. Good call. They start to absorb things the longer they're up. Dialogue, emotions. Eventually they start talking back. He gestured to a trash can. Better burn it. Throwing it away isn't enough. Are you serious? Dead serious. Ryan's eyes met mine. like I'd be about anything in this place, helping me carry the poster outside, where the dumpsters were. Ryan pulled out a lighter, the expensive kind, silver with engravings, and flicked it open. "You smoke?" I asked, surprised. Ryan shook his head. "No, but fire is useful around here." He touched the flame to the corner of the poster, which caught quickly. As it burned, I swear I heard that whisper again, but distorted, angry. Ryan and I watched in silence until nothing remained but ashes. Back inside, Ryan led me to the empty break room. He checked the hallway before closing the door. "Look," he said, voice low. "I know this place is strange. You've probably got a million questions, but asking too many questions gets people killed here." "Like David," I said. Ryan winced. "Yeah, like David." He ran a hand through his hair. "I've been working here almost a year, longer than most. I've survived because I keep my head down and follow the rules. But what is this place?" I pressed. "Why the rules? Why does the building seem alive?" Ryan paced the small room, glancing nervously at the walls as if they might be listening. "There are spaces where things bleed through. Theaters are like that anyway. Places of stories, of emotions, of other worlds projected onto screens. But this one," he gestured vaguely, "this one's different. Like the membrane between here and somewhere else got worn too thin." "Ghosts?" I suggested, skeptical despite everything I'd seen. Ryan laughed, a brittle sound. "I wish it were that simple. Ghosts would be easier to deal with." He leaned closer. "Ever hear of psychic imprinting? When emotions get so strong they leave marks on physical spaces?" I nodded slowly. "This building isn't haunted by people who died here," Ryan continued. "It's haunted by every emotion that's ever been felt inside it. Every fear, every grief, every moment of madness captured on film and projected onto those screens. It's all soaked in, layer upon layer, decade after decade." I thought about that, about the weight of thousands of viewers experiencing thousands of stories, all those emotions concentrated in one decaying building. "And the woman in theater number 5? I asked. Ryan's face tightened. "That's different. She's not just an imprint. She's what happens when grief becomes something more autonomous. They say she was a mother who lost her daughter in a fire here, back in the 40s. She hanged herself in that theater a year later. But what's in there now isn't entirely her anymore." A memory flashed. That silhouette I'd glimpsed through the door window. The smell of burning hair. "Then what is it?" I asked. Ryan rubbed at his arms as if suddenly cold. "It's grief that learned how to feed." He checked his watch. "Look, I've got to get back to concessions. Just be careful, okay? And whatever you do, don't go into theater number 5. After Ryan left, I sat alone in the break room, staring at that laminated list of rules. They didn't seem so ridiculous anymore. Not after what I'd seen and heard. I felt the weight of them, the necessity of their existence. And underneath that, a growing certainty that sooner or later, I'd have to confront whatever was in theater number 5. The evening dragged on with an almost oppressive normalcy. A handful of customers trickled in for the late shows, each of them seeming slightly off. Too quiet, eyes a bit too empty, as if they were sleepwalking through their routines. I began to wonder if they were even real, or just manifestations of the building's strange energy. Around 11 p.m., as the last patrons were leaving, Donna emerged from her office. She looked haggard, dark circles under her eyes, her movements stiff as if fighting exhaustion. "Adrian," she called, beckoning me over. "I need help in the projection room." Film reels jammed again. I followed her up a narrow, creaking staircase to the projection booth, a cramped space with outdated equipment that somehow kept running. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old celluloid. A massive projector dominated the center of the room, its mechanical guts exposed where Donna had been working. "Hold this steady," she instructed, pointing to a metal rod. I gripped it while she reached deeper into the machinery. "So," she said casually, not looking at me, "I hear you've been asking questions." My stomach tightened. "Just trying to understand the place." Donna's hands worked deftly inside the projector. "Understanding isn't always helpful here. Sometimes it's better not to know. Is that why you didn't warn me about what happened to David? I couldn't keep the accusation from my voice. Donna paused, then continued working. Would you have taken the job if I'd told you the truth? When I didn't answer, she nodded. Exactly. Besides, some things have to be experienced to be believed. She pulled out a tangled strip of film, holding it up to the light. The images on it shifted subtly as I watched, like they were changing their composition. I blinked, sure it was a trick of the light. This building has appetites, Donna said, carefully rewinding the film. It consumes emotion, memory, fear. The rules keep it, not satisfied but manageable. And you've just accepted that? I asked. People dying, disappearing? Donna's eyes met mine, and there was something ancient in them, something worn beyond mere human exhaustion. Do you think I had a choice? Do you think any of us did? She slammed the projector housing shut with more force than necessary. We all end up here because we're desperate in some way. Financially, emotionally, broken enough to ignore the warning signs. Her gaze moved over me, assessing. You're still raw from losing your friend. I can see it. That grief, that guilt. It's like candy to this place. I stepped back, unsettled by her insight. How did you? I've seen enough people come through here. I recognized the signs. She wiped her hands on a rag, leaving dark smudges. The building calls to people who are already haunted in some way. That's why you felt compelled to take the job, despite everything. The thought chilled me to the bone. Had I been chosen somehow? Drawn here because of my own personal ghosts? What about you? I asked. What's your story? Donna's expression hardened. My story is written on every inch of this building. 27 years I've been here. I've outlasted every employee, every manager before me. She moved to the booth's single grime-covered window, looking out over the empty theater below. I've made sacrifices you couldn't begin to understand. Something in her tone made me think she wasn't just talking about long hours or low pay. Why not just leave? I asked. Close the place down? Donna laughed, a sound like dead leaves scraping across pavement. You think I haven't tried? This place doesn't let go easily. And even if I could, where would it focus its hunger then? Better to contain it here, with people who at least have some warning, than let it loose on the world. She turned to face me. The rules exist because someone wrote them in blood and pain. Each one was learned through terrible loss. Honor that, if nothing else. Before I could respond, a sound filtered up from below, a faint melodic humming. A woman's voice, singing a lullaby I didn't recognize. It seemed to come from theater number 5. Donna went rigid. Get out, she hissed. Now, back to the lobby. I hesitated, straining to hear the singing. Now. Donna shoved me toward the door, her face pale. And cover your ears. Don't listen to her song. I stumbled down the stairs, hands pressed over my ears as instructed, though part of me wanted desperately to hear more of that haunting melody. In the lobby, I found Ryan pacing nervously. You heard it too? He asked, seeing my expression. I nodded, slowly lowering my hands. What is that? She sings when she's hungry, Ryan said, voice barely audible. When she's looking for someone new to join her grief. The humming had stopped, but its echo seemed to linger in the walls. Ryan and I stood in uncomfortable silence, both of us straining to hear if it would begin again. The building creaked around us, as if settling its weight. Donna's been here 27 years, I said finally. How is that even possible? The toll this place takes. Ryan's expression darkened. Donna's different. She's negotiated terms. He glanced around, then leaned closer. I found something in the basement archives once. Old records, employee logs going back to the 40s. There was a Donna Harlow listed as an usher in 1952. That's impossible, I said. She'd be ancient. Exactly. Ryan's eyes held a frightened knowledge. I think she made a deal long ago. She feeds the building so it doesn't consume her. Feeds it what? I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. Ryan just looked at me, his silence confirmation enough. Disposable employees, people like us. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Aren't you afraid she'll... I'm telling you because I think you might be the only one who can help end this, Ryan interrupted. There's something different about you. The way the building reacts to your presence. Haven't you noticed? I frowned. What do you mean? The lights don't flicker as much when you're around. The sounds in the walls quiet down. Ryan glanced toward theater number 5. And she's never sung like that before, not in all the time I've been here. I didn't like the implications of that I was somehow special, marked. I'm just a broke film school graduate, I insisted. There's nothing different about me. Ryan's eyes met mine, serious. We all carry different kinds of grief, different kinds of guilt. Yours resonates with this place in a specific way. I thought of my dead friend, of the film projects we'd dreamed up together that would never be made, of that last day in the hospital when I'd been too late to say goodbye, caught in traffic while he slipped away. The guilt of that had been eating me alive. Was that what drew me here? Did that make the theater respond to me? From the direction of Donna's office came the sound of breaking glass, followed by a muffled curse. Ryan tensed. She's trying to appease it, he whispered. It gets worse at night, especially after the singing. I didn't want to think about what appeasing it might entail, but I was starting to understand the gravity of what I'd stumbled into. A place where grief and guilt weren't just emotions, but currency. Where the walls themselves had appetites that could never be fully satisfied. What do we do? I asked, surprised to find myself already thinking in terms of we rather than I. Ryan's face showed a flicker of hope, quickly suppressed. For now, survive the night. Follow the rules. He glanced at his watch. It's almost midnight. We need to sweep the balcony. Rule number 3 flashed in my mind. Sweep the balcony in total darkness. They see best in the light, and if you let them see you, they might decide you belong with them. I'll get the brooms, I said quietly. The balcony of the Wellington Grand was a forgotten space, accessible only by a narrow staircase near the emergency exit. As Ryan and I climbed the creaking steps, brooms in hand, I felt the air change, becoming colder, thicker, almost resistant to our passage. The darkness at the top of the stairs was absolute, a perfect void. Remember, Ryan whispered as we reached the landing. No lights. Not even your phone. They see by light. What exactly are they? I asked, keeping my voice low. Ryan was silent for a moment. Former patrons, he finally said. People who came to watch but never left. At least, not all of them. And we're supposed to sweep in pitch darkness because they can only see you if there's light. And if they see you, they might think you're one of them, lost and confused. They try to help you find your seat. The way he emphasized seat made it clear he wasn't talking about theater seating. Great, I muttered. Blind sweeping it is. We stepped into the balcony, and I smelled something like old perfume. Stay close, Ryan said. Follow the wall with your left hand. Sweep with your right. Don't stray into the center. We began moving along the perimeter, brooms scraping softly across the sticky floor. I focused on the sound of Ryan's breathing ahead of me, the feel of the textured wallpaper beneath my fingertips. As we worked our way around, I became aware of other sounds in the darkness, soft creaks, the rustle of fabric, a barely perceptible sigh. It felt like we were sharing the space with others, though I could see nothing. Ryan, I whispered, I think there's... Don't acknowledge them, he cut me off, voice tense. They're always here. Just keep sweeping. I continued, trying to ignore the growing sensation of being watched by dozens of unseen eyes. Then I heard it. A whisper, directly behind my right ear. Excuse me, is this seat taken? I froze, every muscle locking. The voice was feminine, elderly, with an empty quality that made my skin crawl. Keep moving, Ryan hissed from somewhere ahead. Don't answer. Don't turn around. I forced myself forward, my hand sliding along the wall, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure it would give us away. The presence followed, a cold spot traveling with me like a shadow. I believe you're in my row, young man. The voice came again, closer to my ear, insistent. Would you mind letting me pass? I bit my lip hard enough to taste blood. The broom trembled in my grip. We're almost done, Ryan called softly. Just a few more feet to the exit. The voice behind me grew frustrated. It's very rude to ignore someone, you know. My husband and I have had these seats for 30 years. Then, more alarmingly, a second voice, male. Margaret, leave the boy alone. He's not one of ours yet. I nearly gasped aloud. Ryan must have sensed my panic because he suddenly gripped my wrist, pulling me forward more quickly. Don't engage, he repeated urgently. We're almost there. The exit was close. I could feel a slight draft of fresher air. But as we approached, something changed in the atmosphere. The whispers multiplied, voices layering upon voices, indistinct but agitated. Then Ryan stumbled, cursing under his breath. I heard the clatter of his broom hitting the floor. Ryan? I whispered urgently. No response. Ryan! Louder this time, panic rising. A hand gripped my shoulder, from the wrong direction behind me. I yelped, jerking away. More hands now, tugging at my clothes, my hair. Stay with us, multiple voices urged. The show is about to begin. I dropped my broom, abandoning all protocol. Ryan! I shouted into the darkness. The hands grew stronger, their grip more solid. Cold fingers brushed my cheek, my neck. I lashed out blindly, connecting with nothing. Then a beam of light cut through the darkness, the emergency exit sign suddenly illuminated. In its red glow, I caught glimpses of figures in the balcony seats, dozens of them, translucent, heads turning toward the light, and toward me. Their eyes reflected the light like animals caught in headlights. Empty, hungry eyes. Here, Ryan's voice called from near the exit. Move. I ran, stumbling over seats, feeling cold hands grasping as I passed. In the dim red light, I could see the exit door and Ryan's silhouette holding it open. Behind him stood a figure I hadn't expected. Lucy, her face pale with fear. I burst through the door, and Ryan slammed it shut behind me. We stood in the narrow stairwell, gasping for breath. Lucy held a small remote control, her thumb still pressing a button. Emergency lighting override, she explained shakily. Flips on the exit signs, drives them back to their seats. She eyed me with concern. You okay? They didn't touch you too much, did they? I ran my hands over my body, still feeling phantom fingers on my skin. I think I'm fine. What were those things? Ryan and Lucy exchanged glances. People who never left, Ryan said, repeating his earlier explanation. But not ghosts, Lucy added. More like impressions. Echoes caught in a feedback loop. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm my racing heart. Why are we sweeping up there at all? Why not just seal it off? Because that's what it wants, Lucy said grimly. To be left alone to grow stronger. The sweeping is a way of asserting control, I guess, reminding them that this is still our space, at least partly. Ryan nodded. The balcony is a border zone. We let it slip once, about 6 years ago according to the logs. They started appearing in the main theater. 3 patrons went missing in one night. My skin crawled at the thought. So we're what? Janitors and zookeepers rolled into one? More like wardens, Lucy said softly, keeping the boundary intact. We made our way down the stairs in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. When we reached the lobby, Donna was waiting, arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable, but I detected a flicker of relief when she saw the 3 of us intact. Cutting it close with the lighting, she remarked to Lucy. 5 more seconds and they might have manifested fully. Lucy ducked her head. Sorry, I couldn't find the remote right away. Donna's gaze shifted to me. First balcony duty. How was it? There was something testing in her tone, as if my answer mattered more than it should. I met her eyes. Educational, I said flatly. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Good answer. Now all of you finish closing up. It's nearly 1 a.m. and you don't want to be here when the concession phone starts ringing. As she walked away, I turned to Ryan and Lucy. The phone actually rings? Like regularly? Lucy nodded, her face somber. Every night between 2 and 4 a.m. never fails. And if we answer wrong? Ryan's expression darkened. Remember Darren? The guy who disappeared last month? He answered with hello Grand Theater instead of final show is over. The next morning we found his uniform in the men's room. Just his uniform. The implication sent a chill through me. I glanced at the old rotary phone behind the concession counter, innocuous in the fluorescent light, but there was something ominous about it now, like a loaded gun waiting to be fired. "Who calls?" I asked, not sure I wanted the answer. "No one knows," Lucy said. "But whatever's on the other end, it's been trying to get in for a long time." As we finished our closing duties, I felt the weight of the rules more acutely than ever. For the first time, I began to understand Donna's grim dedication to keeping the theater running, despite all it had cost her. She wasn't just preserving a building, she was maintaining a prison, one that occasionally devoured its own guards. The next few days passed in a blur. I fell into the rhythm of the Wellington Grand, selling tickets to the scattered patrons who wandered in, sweeping floors, changing posters before they ripened into something dangerous. At night, I helped Ryan and Lucy with the rituals that kept the building's hungers at bay. I began to notice subtle changes in myself. I jumped at shadows less often. And most disturbing of all, I found myself thinking of the rules as normal, even necessary, as if I'd been following them all my life. But just as I had gotten used to things, 1 week after my first shift, I was counting the register after closing when Lucy appeared at my side, her expression tense. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "All of us." Ryan found something. She led me to the break room, where Ryan sat hunched over a small stack of yellowed papers. Donna was noticeably absent, locked in her office as she often was this time of night. The clock on the wall read 11:48 p.m. Ryan looked up as we entered, his face drawn. "I found these while searching for the old maintenance logs," he said, pushing the papers toward me. They were hidden inside a false wall panel in the basement. I picked up the top sheet, a letter dated June 17, 1956, written in a slanting, elegant hand. "Dearest Thomas, the situation at the Grand grows more untenable each day. Mrs. Harlow continues to insist that we maintain the protocols she established, despite the increasing evidence that they only delay rather than prevent the inevitable. 3 more patrons disappeared during last night's showing of The Bad Seed. Their personal effects remained in their seats, but of the individuals themselves, no trace could be found. Mrs. Harlow insists this is a natural thinning of the veil that occurs during certain films and that we must simply adapt the protocols accordingly. I fear she has been maintaining these charades far too long. Her judgment is compromised. There is something unwholesome in the way she speaks of the building, as if it were a living entity with needs and desires. More disturbing still is her apparent youth despite her many decades of service here. I have begun to document the true nature of the occurrences for posterity in the event of my own disappearance. The journal is hidden where she will not think to look. With deepest concern, Margaret Ellington, Assistant Manager. I looked up, blood running cold. "Mrs. Harlow? As in Donna Harlow?" Ryan nodded grimly. "That's the thing. I checked the employee records. Donna Harlow is listed as manager in 1956, and in 1975, and in 1992. That's impossible," I said, though after what I'd seen in this place, impossible felt like an increasingly meaningless concept. Lucy wrapped her arms around herself. "Unless she's found a way to, I don't know, feed the building something it wants more than her." "There's more," Ryan said, sliding another document toward me. This one was a brittle newspaper clipping from 1964, headlined, "Local Theater Fire Claims Child, Mother Missing." The article detailed a projection booth fire at the Wellington Grand that had killed a 5-year-old girl who had been visiting her mother, an employee. The mother, Catherine Reeves, had disappeared after the fire, presumed by authorities to have fled in grief or perhaps taken her own life. "Theater number 5, Lucy whispered. "That's where it happened." I stared at the grainy photograph accompanying the article. The damaged theater, the solemn firefighters, and in the background, barely visible, a figure watching from the shadows. A figure that looked disturbingly like a younger version of Donna, though the image was too blurry to be certain. "You think Donna is, what? Immortal?" I asked, struggling to process. Ryan shook his head. "Not immortal. More like preserved. The building keeps her the same age as long as she feeds it. Feeds it what? I demanded, though I feared I already knew the answer. People, Lucy said softly. Staff, patrons, whatever it can get. A chill ran down my spine. So all these protocols, these rules, they're not to protect us. They're to keep the feeding controlled. Ryan nodded slowly. A regular diet rather than a feast or famine. Donna ensures the building gets what it wants, and in return, she doesn't age, I finished. She doesn't become another victim. Lucy leaned forward, eyes intense. But there's something else. That girl who died in the fire? Catherine? I think she's connected to the woman in theater number 5. Not the same person, but linked somehow. I thought about the burnt smell that lingered around theater number 5, the glimpse of a silhouette I'd seen that first day. So what do we do with this information? Ryan and Lucy exchanged glances. We were hoping you might have ideas, Lucy admitted. You're different from the other new hires. You notice things, you question things, and you still have one foot in the outside world, Ryan added. Most of us. We've been here too long. This place gets in your head after a while, makes it hard to imagine anything else. I looked at these two people, practically strangers a week ago, now bound to me by shared terror and grim purpose. We need more information, I said, about Donna, about what happened in 1964, about how this building works. There might be a way, Lucy said hesitantly. The journal mentioned in the letter, if we could find it. It could be anywhere, Ryan pointed out. Hidden in a wall under a floorboard. This building has 1,000 hiding places. I thought for a moment. Not anywhere. Somewhere she will not think to look. That's what the letter said. I tapped the newspaper clipping. What about theater number 5? Would Donna go in there? Lucy paled. No, she avoids it completely. I've never seen her even touch the door. Then that's where we start, I said, surprising myself with my resolve. We need to search theater number 5. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, a palpable tension crackling through the air. That's a death mission, Ryan hissed. Rule number 1 exists for a reason. The woman in there, whatever she is, she doesn't just kill people. She absorbs them into her grief. Lucy nodded, eyes wide. I've heard her sometimes late at night, crying, calling for Catherine. If you go in there, she'll think you're her daughter, or she'll punish you for not being her daughter. Either way, I scratched my head. Then we go together. Safety in numbers, right? Before either could respond, the break room door swung open. Donna stood in the threshold, her expression unreadable. How long had she been there? What had she heard? Planning a little expedition? She asked, her voice dangerously soft. We froze, guilt written plainly across our faces. Donna stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. You know, curiosity is a luxury none of us can afford here, she continued, eyeing the papers on the table. With deliberate slowness, she reached out and gathered them up. Especially not after midnight, when the building is most aware. We know about you, I blurted, unable to contain myself. About how long you've been here. About what you're doing. Donna smiled, a sad, tired expression. Do you now? You've been here what, a week? And you think you understand decades of history, of sacrifice, of necessity? She sat down, placing the papers carefully in her lap. For a long moment, she simply studied us, like a teacher disappointed with her students. Yes, I've been here a very long time, she finally said. Longer than any of you can comprehend. And yes, I maintain certain arrangements with this building, but not out of selfishness or hunger for immortality. Her eyes met mine, challenging. Out of necessity. Necessity? Lucy echoed, disbelieving. Donna nodded. This building contains things that should never be released into the world. Grief that would consume entire towns. Hungers that would devour souls by the thousands. Do you think these rules, these protocols are arbitrary? They're containment measures, refined through blood and loss. You sacrifice people, Ryan said flatly. Donna didn't flinch. Sometimes, when necessary, when the alternative would be far worse. She sighed, suddenly looking her true age despite her relatively youthful appearance. The woman in theater number 5, she lost her child here. Her grief became something elemental, something that could spread like a disease if not contained. Catherine Reeves, I said. The girl who died in the fire. Donna's eyes widened slightly. You've been thorough. She nodded. Yes, Catherine died when a film reel caught fire. Old nitrate film burns hot and fast. Her mother, Elaine, was working concession. She heard the screams but couldn't reach her daughter in time. And you were here, Lucy pressed. You saw it happen. I was assistant manager then, Donna admitted. Young, idealistic. I tried to help Elaine afterward, but her sadness, it wasn't normal. It was consuming her from the inside out. And then it started affecting others. Patrons would leave screenings in theater number 5 weeping uncontrollably, some driven to self-harm. The grief was spreading. Ryan leaned forward. So what happened? Donna's fingers traced patterns on the yellowed papers. Elaine killed herself in theater number 5, hanging from the balcony rail. But her death didn't end it. Her emotions had already bonded with the building. It remained, growing stronger, drawing people into its orbit. And you found a way to contain it, I guessed, by feeding it. What? Emotions? Memories? People, Donna said simply. Not innocent patrons, not if I can help it. But those who break the rules, who disturb the delicate balance, they become necessary sacrifices. Like your friend David. I felt sick. So you let people die to keep this grief monster satisfied? Donna's eyes flashed. I let a few suffer so that thousands don't. Do you have any idea what would happen if the Wellington Grand was demolished? If those entities were released without a vessel to contain them? She gestured around us. This building is a prison. And yes, sometimes the guards must sacrifice one of their own to prevent a mass breakout. The room fell silent. As much as I wanted to argue, to rage against her cold utilitarianism, a part of me understood her terrible logic. If what she said was true, if the building really did contain horrors that would otherwise spread unchecked, then her actions, however monstrous, served a greater purpose. Why you? Lucy finally asked. Why are you the one who has to maintain this arrangement? Something shifted in Donna's expression, a flicker of ancient pain. Because I was there at the beginning. Because I made promises that can't be broken. She stood, placing the papers on the table. And because no one else has survived long enough to take my place. She moved to the door, then paused, looking back at us. The night shift ends in 20 minutes. Go home. Rest. And tomorrow, remember the rules. They're what keep us all alive. As she left, the atmosphere in the break room lightened subtly, as if her departure had released some unseen pressure. We sat in stunned silence, processing her revelations. Do you believe her? Lucy whispered finally. I stared at the papers on the table, the evidence of decades of darkness. I don't know, I admitted. But I know one thing. I'm not abandoning our plan. We need to find that journal. We need the whole truth, not just Donna's version of it. Ryan nodded slowly. Tomorrow then. During the day shift when the building's less aware. Theater number 5, Lucy confirmed, though her voice trembled. God help us. I barely slept that night. Images of Catherine Reeves, a child I'd never met, swirled through my dreams. I saw her burning, screaming, reaching out for a mother who couldn't save her. And behind it all, Donna's face. Watching. Always watching. Calculating the necessary sacrifices. Morning brought no relief. I arrived at the Wellington Grand early. My stomach knotted with dread and determination. The building seemed to sense my intentions. The air felt thicker inside, resistant to my movements, and the lights dimmed as I passed beneath them. Lucy was already there, pacing the lobby with nervous energy. Ryan called in sick, she said as I approached, her voice low. But I think he's just scared. Can't really blame him. I nodded, understanding. So it's just us? Just us. She gnawed at her lower lip. Donna's in a meeting with the distributor in town. Won't be back until afternoon. If we're going to do this, Now's the time, I finished. We made our way through the empty theater, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The morning shows wouldn't start for another hour. We had a brief window where the building was as dormant as it ever got. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, evaluated. Theater number 5 was at the end of the west corridor, its entrance partially hidden in an alcove. The closed sign hung limply from a pushpin, the paper yellowed with age. Lucy hung back as I approached, her eyes wide with barely contained terror. "We don't have to do this," I said, giving her an out. "I can go alone." She shook her head fiercely. "No way. Rule number 2, remember? One soul can be too easy a meal. We go together or not at all." I appreciated her courage, though I could see it cost her. Carefully I removed the sign, my fingers tingling where they touched the paper. Then, with a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The smell hit us first, burnt hair and something sweeter, like decaying flowers. The theater beyond was dark, lit only by the dim glow of emergency lights near the floor. Rows of seats stretched into shadow, their velvet coverings worn thin by decades of use. The screen at the front was tattered, bearing a grayish tinge that no amount of cleaning could remove. "Look for hiding places," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Loose floorboards, hollow spaces in the walls." Lucy nodded, staying close to me as we moved down the aisle. The air felt heavy with grief, not metaphorically, but literally heavy, pressing against our skin like a physical weight. Each breath was an effort. "Adrian," Lucy whispered, pointing. "The projection booth." Above the rear of the theater, a small window showed where the projection booth overlooked the space. Of course, Margaret Ellington had been assistant manager, with access to all areas. And what better place to hide a journal than the room where Catherine had died? We found the door to the booth at the back of the theater, a narrow, unmarked entrance that looked like it might be a closet. It was locked, but the aged wood gave way with a solid shove from my shoulder. Beyond was a steep, narrow staircase, thick with dust. "No one's been up here in years," Lucy observed, voice hushed. The booth itself was a time capsule. Old equipment from the 1960s sat undisturbed, covered in a thick layer of dust. Film canisters lined one wall, their labels faded beyond reading. A small desk was pushed against another wall, its surface bare except for an ancient mug. The contents long since evaporated to dust. "Start searching," I urged, moving to the desk. "Look for anything that could conceal a journal." We worked in silence, acutely aware that Donna could return at any moment, or worse, that we might attract the attention of Theater Number 5's resident entity. The booth felt unnaturally cold despite the warm spring day outside, and the air held a metallic tang, like blood. After several minutes of fruitless searching, Lucy made a small sound of triumph. "Adrian, look at this." She was pointing to the floor beneath the projector, a section of boards that didn't quite match the others. Dropping to my knees, I ran my fingers along the edges, feeling for a gap. There, a slight indentation in one corner. I pressed, and the board popped up slightly. Together, we lifted the false floor panel, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside lay a leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age. Beside it was something unexpected, a film reel in a metal canister, unlabeled. I lifted the journal reverently, aware that I was holding decades of hidden truth in my hands. The pages were brittle, threatening to crumble at my touch. I opened it carefully, scanning the first entry. April 3rd, 1956. I begin this record with grave misgivings about what I have witnessed at the Wellington Grand. Mrs. Harlow insists that the disturbances are only due to the building settling into its nature, but I cannot accept such obfuscation. There is something alive here, something that feeds on emotion, particularly grief and fear. The protocols she has established do seem to keep the worst manifestations at bay, but at what cost? 3 ushers have disappeared since January, and Mrs. Harlow shows no distress, merely notes in her ledger that they have moved on. I've seen her entering Theater Number 3 with one such departed employee's personal effects, like offerings to some pagan god. Most disturbing of all is her appearance. In photographs from the theater's opening in 1932, she appears as a woman of about 30. 24 years later, she has not aged a day. When questioned, she merely smiles that secretive smile and changes the subject. I fear what this place is becoming, or perhaps what it has been all along. I looked up at Lucy, whose face had gone pale. Theater number 3? I thought the woman was in number 5? She nodded. Now, yes, but this was before the fire, before Catherine died. Her eyes widened with realization. What if the entity in theater number 5 isn't just Elaine's grief? What if it's older? A chill ran down my spine. Something that was already here, that attached itself to Elaine's grief because it was so powerful. Lucy nodded slowly. And Donna's been feeding it for decades, using the rules to keep it contained but satisfied. I turned more pages of the journal, skimming entries that documented increasingly strange occurrences, moving shadows in the balcony, patrons emerging from screenings with memories of films different from what had been shown, a projectionist who claimed to see faces in the blank frames between scenes. Then I reached an entry from June 1964, the handwriting more hurried, almost frantic. June 18th, 1964. Catastrophe has struck. Young Catherine Reeves, daughter of our concession manager Elaine, has died in a projection booth fire. The official report cites faulty wiring, but I know better. The reel that caught fire was from the private collection, one of those that Mrs. Harlow keeps locked away, that no one is permitted to screen without her supervision. I managed to salvage a fragment of it before the fire consumed everything, even that small piece. The images on it shift when not directly observed. I've sealed it away with this journal. Elaine's grief is beyond anything I've witnessed. It hangs around her like a visible aura, and others who come near her begin to weep without knowing why. Mrs. Harlow watches her with an expression I can only describe as hunger, as if Elaine's suffering is exactly what she's been waiting for. I fear for us all. The next entry was dated 2 weeks later, July 2nd, 1964. Elaine took her life last night in theater number 5, hanged herself from the balcony railing during the midnight showing. The few patrons present fled in terror, but not before several collapsed in paroxysms of uncontrollable weeping. Mrs. Harlow ordered the theater sealed, claiming plumbing issues. I saw her enter it alone late last night, carrying what looked like a film canister. When she emerged hours later, she appeared rejuvenated. The gray at her temples that had begun to appear after decades of impossibly slow aging had vanished completely. I've decided to hide this journal and the film fragment where she will never look, in the very place where Catherine died. My time here is ending. I've tendered my resignation. I only pray that whoever finds this record will understand the gravity of what dwells within these walls. If you are reading this, beware the unmarked reels. Beware the grief that hungers. And most of all, beware Donna Harlow, who is both keeper and servant of whatever ancient appetite has made this theater its home. Margaret Ellington. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. She knew, I whispered. Decades ago, she knew what was happening. Lucy's gaze was fixed on the film canister. Do you think that's it? The fragment she salvaged? With a feeling of dread, I picked up the metal container. It was surprisingly heavy, as if the contents were denser than normal film stock. The lid was sealed with what looked like wax, cracked from age. We shouldn't open it, Lucy said, though her tone suggested morbid curiosity rather than true caution. Agreed, I said, setting it down carefully. But we should take it with the journal. It's evidence. A sudden sharp sound from below made us both freeze, the creak of the theater door opening. We held our breath, listening. Footsteps in the aisle. Then a voice. Not Donna's, but soft and feminine. Catherine? Are you hiding again, sweetie? Mommy's not angry. Just come out. Lucy's face drained of color. She mouthed silently. Elaine. The footsteps continued, moving up the aisle toward the front of the theater. A faint humming floated up to us. The same lullaby I'd heard that night in the projection booth. Beautiful, haunting, wrong. I know you're here, Catherine, the voice called again, closer now. I can feel you. Both of you. I clutched the journal to my chest, mind racing. We were trapped in the booth with only one exit that would lead us directly back into the theater where that thing was searching for us. "What do we do?" Lucy whispered, barely audible. I glanced around desperately, looking for an alternative escape route. The booth had a small window that overlooked the theater. Too small to climb through, but I could see into the space below. A figure stood in the center aisle, looking up toward the booth. It resembled a woman, but wrong in subtle, disturbing ways. Her proportions were slightly off, her movements too fluid, as if she had more joints than a human should. Her face was obscured by long dark hair, but what little I could see appeared burned on one side, the skin blackened and cracked. She wore what might have once been a theater uniform, now charred and tattered. "I know you have something of mine," the figure called, voice shifting to something harder, angrier. "Something precious. Something stolen." She tilted her head up, hair parting to reveal eyes that glowed faintly in the dim theater, not reflecting light but generating their own sickly luminescence. Those eyes fixed directly on the booth window, directly on me. "Thief," she hissed, the word distorting with layers of other voices beneath it. "Run," I gasped to Lucy. "Now." We bolted for the door, Lucy clutching the film canister while I held the journal. The temperature dropped further as we descended the narrow stairs, frost actually forming on the walls. The door at the bottom felt sealed shut, as if tremendous pressure were being exerted from the other side. I rammed my shoulder against it repeatedly, panic lending me strength. On the third try, it burst open, sending us stumbling into the theater. The entity, Elaine, or what remained of her, stood at the base of the stairs, blocking our path to the exit. Up close, she was even more wrong. Her body seemed to shift and ripple beneath her ruined clothing, as if multiple forms were trying to occupy the same space. Her burnt face contorted in a parody of maternal concern. "My Catherine," she crooned, reaching for Lucy with elongated fingers. "And you've brought a friend. How nice. How very nice." Lucy whimpered, backing away. I pulled her behind me, though I had no idea how to protect either of us from this thing. The journal felt warm against my chest, almost vibrating with contained knowledge. A new voice cut through the heavy air. "Elaine." Enough. Donna stood in the theater entrance, her face contorted with fury and fear. She held something in her hand, a small black box that emitted a soft, rhythmic clicking. The entity's attention snapped to Donna, her form rippling more violently. "Betrayer," she snarled. "Keeper of broken promises. You said you'd bring her back to me." "And I will," Donna said, her voice softer now, placating. "But not these two. They're not yours to take." "Liar!" The thing that had been Elaine screamed, the sound reverberating painfully in my skull. "Decades of lies. You feed me scraps when you promised me my daughter." Donna advanced slowly into the theater, the black box held before her like a shield. "These two are leaving now," she said firmly. "Your quarrel is with me, not them." The entity twisted toward us again, indecision rippling across her burnt features. Then, with startling swiftness, she lunged, not at us, but at Donna, covering the distance between them in an impossible blur of motion. "Go!" Donna shouted as the entity engulfed her, their forms seeming to merge in a writhing mass of shadow and grief. "Get out!" Lucy and I didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted past the struggling figures, the journal and film canister clutched tightly in our grasp. The theater door seemed miles away, the air thick as molasses, resisting our passage. Behind us, Donna's voice had changed. She was now crooning to the entity, soothing it, using words in a language I didn't recognize. We burst through the door into the corridor, gasping for breath. Behind us, the door to theater number 5 slammed shut with such force that the frame cracked. For a moment, we stood frozen, expecting pursuit, but the corridor remained empty. The only sound our ragged breathing and the faint, muffled noise of what might have been singing from behind the sealed door. "What? What now?" Lucy asked, voice shaking. She still clutched the film canister like a lifeline. I looked down at the journal in my hands, the record of decades of darkness, of grief weaponized, of a manager who had made terrible compromises to contain something even more terrible. "Now we read," I said grimly. All of it. And then we decide what to do with this place, once and for all. As we walked away, I couldn't help glancing back at theater number 5. Through the narrow window in the door, I caught a glimpse of movement. Donna, her back to the entrance, arms outstretched as if in supplication. Before her stood Elaine, her burnt face tilted as if listening to a story only she could hear. We fled to the closest safe place we could think of, the concession stand storage room, a mundane space filled with boxes of popcorn kernels and syrup containers for the soda machines. The normality of it was almost shocking after our encounter in theater number 5. Lucy slumped against a shelf, her breathing still uneven. We need to leave, she gasped. Get out of here while Donna's occupied. I clutched the journal. We can't just run, I said. Not yet. We need to understand what we're dealing with. What we're dealing with. Lucy's voice rose hysterically. Did you see that thing? It's not human, Adrian. It never was. Keep your voice down, I warned, glancing at the door. We don't know who or what might be listening. Lucy pressed her hands to her face, struggling for composure. After a moment, she lowered them, eyes red but dry. Fine. But we read it here now, and then we make a plan. I nodded, carefully setting the journal on a stack of napkin boxes while Lucy placed the film canister beside it. We took turns reading the journal aloud in hushed voices, piecing together the history that Donna had kept hidden. Margaret Ellington's documentation revealed a pattern stretching back to the theater's opening in 1932. Disappearances, unexplained phenomena, and Donna Harlow's ageless presence through it all. The Wellington Grand, it seemed, had never been an ordinary theater. According to Margaret's research, it had been built on land with a troubled history, a site where, decades earlier, a traveling carnival had camped, featuring a grief-eater attraction. Patrons would enter a tent and emerge mysteriously unburdened of their sorrows, while the carnival workers grew increasingly gaunt and hollow-eyed. When the carnival departed, they left something behind, something that found a new home in the freshly constructed theater. The early disappearances were attributed to construction accidents or patrons wandering into unfinished areas, but Margaret had uncovered a darker pattern. The building was feeding, slowly and methodically, on the emotions of those who entered. Donna had not created this hunger. She had simply learned to manage it. As a young usher in the 1930s, she had witnessed the disappearance of her fellow staff members, the strange behavior of patrons who watched certain film reels, the gradual awakening of something ancient and ravenous within the walls. The rules had evolved organically, hard lessons learned through tragedy and loss. Each one corresponded to a specific incident, a particular manifestation of the building's hunger. And Donna, rather than fleeing, had made what Margaret called a devil's bargain. She would provide the building with carefully measured sustenance, and in return, it would grant her unnatural longevity and a measure of control over its appetites. The most disturbing revelations concerned the film reels. Certain movies, it seemed, resonated with the entity at the theater's heart. Films about loss, grief, obsession. These would sometimes merge with the building's hunger, creating hybrid manifestations that fed more aggressively. These were the unmarked reels, quarantined by Donna, films that had been irreversibly altered by proximity to the entity. Jesus, Lucy whispered as we finished the final entry. This place, it's been consuming people for almost a century. I nodded, my mind reeling with the implications. And Donna's been containing it, in her own twisted way. Containing it, but also feeding it, Lucy pointed out. Sacrificing people like David, like that usher Darren, to keep it satisfied. My gaze drifted to the film canister. What about that? The fragment Margaret saved. Lucy eyed it warily. Rule number 2, unmarked reels require a witness. But should we even risk it? I considered the dangers. The journal had mentioned that even small fragments of these altered films could be dangerous, windows into whatever space the entity partially inhabited. But it might also contain crucial information, something Margaret had deemed important enough to preserve alongside her written warnings. If we're going to understand what we're up against, we need to see it, I said finally. But we follow the rule, 2 witnesses, not 1. Lucy nodded reluctantly. The employee lounge has an old VCR. We could convert this to VHS if there's a way to. No need, I interrupted, an idea forming. The old trailer viewing room. It still has an 8mm projector. I saw it when I was helping Donna last week. The small viewing room was tucked behind the main projection booth, a cramped space where theater managers would once preview upcoming films. Modern theaters had long since abandoned such rooms, but the Wellington Grand preserved it like so many other relics of cinema's past. We made our way there cautiously, avoiding the few employees who had arrived for the day shift. The building felt different now, more alert somehow, as if our discoveries had awakened something long dormant. The viewing room was dusty but functional, with a small screen on one wall and an ancient projector on a central table. 2 chairs faced the screen, their upholstery worn thin by decades of use. Lucy locked the door behind us while I carefully opened the film canister. Inside was indeed a fragment of 8mm film, perhaps 30 seconds worth, spun around a small metal spool. The film itself had an odd, oily sheen, and the colors seemed to shift subtly even as I held it still. "Ready?" I asked, threading the fragment into the projector. Lucy sat beside me, her face pale but determined. As I'll ever be. I flipped the switch, and the projector whirred to life, casting a beam of light onto the small screen. For a moment there was nothing but blank white frames clicking through the gate. Then the images began. The footage showed theater number 5, but wrong. The proportions were distorted, the space seeming larger than it should be. Seated patrons watched a screen we couldn't see, their backs to the camera. The film quality was grainy, the colors faded to sepia and blue. Then the camera panned, revealing faces I recognized with a jolt. Donna, decades younger but unmistakable, and beside her a small girl of perhaps 5 or 6. Catherine Reeves, I realized. This must have been shortly before the fire. The unsettling part was how the film seemed alive, pulsing with its own rhythm independent of the projector's steady advance. Frames would stretch, lingering longer than they should, or accelerate, creating a jerky, disorienting effect, and the edges of the frame seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like a living organism. As we watched, Catherine turned toward the camera, her face breaking into a smile. But the smile was wrong, too wide, stretching beyond the confines of a normal human face. Her eyes, initially bright and childlike, darkened until they were empty sockets, weeping what appeared to be celluloid instead of tears. Beside me, Lucy made a small, strangled sound. I wanted to stop the projector, but my hands wouldn't move, paralyzed by the unnatural images. The film cut suddenly to a new scene. The projection booth aflame, Catherine's small figure silhouetted against the blaze. But the fire moved wrong, curling around her like a lover, caressing rather than consuming. As we watched, horrified, Catherine turned again to the camera, her body beginning to blacken but her face serene. Her mouth opened, forming words we couldn't hear. Then the film showed something impossible. The projection booth fire spreading, but instead of destroying, it seemed to be creating. From the flames emerged a figure that resembled Elaine, but distorted, elongated. She reached for Catherine as the fire consumed them both. Their forms merged, becoming the entity we had encountered in theater number 5. The final frame showed Donna watching this transformation, her expression neither surprised nor horrified, but calculating. In her hands was a small black box, the same one she had used earlier to control the entity. She approached the merged figures, mouth moving in what might have been an incantation or a bargain. Then the film ended, leaving us in stunned silence broken only by the clicking of the empty projector. "Turn it off," Lucy whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please." I flipped the switch, plunging the room into relative darkness. We sat motionless, processing what we'd seen. The implications were staggering. Not just a ghost or a manifestation of grief, but something transformative. Something that had used the fire to create a new kind of entity, with Donna's apparent cooperation. "It wasn't an accident," I said finally. "The fire, that film, it suggests Donna knew what would happen." Lucy's face was ashen. "She used them, used Catherine's death and Elaine's grief to To what? Feed the building? Strengthen her control over it? Or to transform it? I suggested grimly. Margaret's journal mentioned that the entity was already here when the theater was built, but maybe it needed a certain kind of catalyst to become what it is now. A grief so profound it could sustain it for decades, Lucy whispered. A mother's loss of her child. I nodded slowly. And Donna's been maintaining that grief, keeping it fresh somehow. That's what the rules are really about. Not just containing the entity, but preserving the specific emotion that powers it. Lucy's eyes widened with sudden understanding. That's why theater number 5 is off limits. Not to protect us from the entity, but to protect the entity itself. To keep Elaine's grief pure and concentrated. A chill ran down my spine as the pieces clicked into place. And the unmarked reels, the dream talk, the phone calls after 2 a.m., they're all potential bridges. Ways for outside emotions or entities to dilute or contaminate the grief that Donna's so carefully cultivated. We sat in horrified silence, the implications settling over us like a shroud. Donna hadn't been containing a monster. She had been nurturing it, using rules and protocols to preserve its potency, while feeding it just enough to keep it from breaking free completely. We have to destroy it, Lucy said suddenly, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. All of it. The theater, the reels, everything. How? I asked. If what we've learned is true, this entity has survived fire, has maybe even been strengthened by it, and Donna has decades of experience controlling it. Lucy's eyes met mine, determined despite her fear. We find its vulnerability. Everything that feeds has something it can't digest. We just need to figure out what that is. Before I could respond, a soft click came from the door. The lock turning from the outside. We froze, staring at the handle as it slowly rotated. The door swung open, revealing Ryan standing in the hallway, his face drawn and pale. There you are, he said, voice unnaturally flat. Donna's looking for you both. She's not happy. I glanced at Lucy, a silent message passing between us. He doesn't know what we've found. I carefully slid the journal inside my jacket while Lucy pocketed the film canister. We're coming, I said, rising from my chair. Where is she? Ryan's eyes were slightly unfocused, his movements stiff. Her office. She wants to discuss your unauthorized exploration of theater number 5. A warning bell rang in my mind. How did Donna know we had been in theater number 5? She had been occupied with the entity when we fled. Unless... Ryan, I said carefully, when did you last see Donna? He blinked, confusion briefly crossing his face. Just now. She sent me to find you. What was she wearing? Lucy asked, picking up on my suspicion. Ryan opened his mouth to answer, then frowned, as if the question had disrupted some script he was following. I don't remember. I grabbed Lucy's arm, pulling her back from the door. That's not Ryan, I hissed. Not entirely. The thing that looked like Ryan smiled, the expression spreading too wide across his face. Clever boy, it said, the voice changing, layering, Ryan's tenor overlaid with Elaine's hollow contralto, but not clever enough to escape. Ryan's body jerked unnaturally, like a puppet on tangled strings. His eyes rolled back, revealing only whites, then returned with irises now tinged with an unnatural amber glow. Donna sends her regrets, the entity said through Ryan's mouth. She's indisposed at the moment, but she wanted me to thank you for finding the journal. Such precious memories, preserved all these years. I backed away, pushing Lucy behind me. We know what you are, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. What you were before, and what you became after the fire. Ryan's head tilted at an impossible angle. Do you? I think not. You've seen shadows of truth, fragments reflected in tarnished mirrors, but you don't know hunger, not truly. We know enough, Lucy said, her voice stronger than I expected. We know you feed on grief, on Elaine's loss of Catherine. We know Donna's been keeping you contained but nourished. The entity laughed, a sound like film tearing through a projector. Contained? Is that what you think? Ryan's body moved forward jerkily. I am this building. Every nail, every board, every seat where someone sat and wept during a tragic scene, all mine. Donna doesn't contain me. She serves me. I felt the blood drain from my face. Then why the rules? Why the protocols? Because even the greatest hunger requires refinement. Ryan's fingers flexed unnaturally. Raw emotion is satisfying but crude. Properly cultivated fear, grief, longing, these are exquisite. Donna understands this. She has for a very long time. Since the carnival, I guessed, remembering Margaret's notes. You were the grief-eater attraction. Ryan's face twisted in what might have been pleasure. Before that, long before, I have worn many masks, inhabited many vessels. The carnival, yes. Before that, a mourning house during the Civil War. Before that, well, grief is as old as humanity, isn't it? Lucy's hand found mine, squeezing tightly. What do you want from us? She asked. The entity moved Ryan's body closer, the movements becoming smoother, more practiced, as if it were settling into the borrowed flesh. I want what I always want, it said simply. To feast. You two are interesting. Your grief has such different flavors. The boy, sharp with guilt over his dead friend. The girl, a slow, fatty grief for a sister wasting away with disease. Lucy gasped at this invasion of her private pain. Donna has been selective in her offerings, the entity continued. Too selective, perhaps, but with you two, with what you've discovered. Perhaps a more substantial meal is in order. I glanced around desperately, looking for an escape route. The viewing room had no other exit, and the entity blocked the only door. My mind raced, trying to recall anything from the journal or film that might help us. Then it hit me. The black box. Both in the film and in theater number 5, Donna had used some kind of device to control or at least influence the entity. The journal had mentioned it briefly, a resonator that could temporarily disrupt the entity's form by emitting certain frequencies. Where's Donna now? I asked, stalling for time. You said she's indisposed. What does that mean? Ryan's face stretched in an approximation of concern. Poor Donna. She's resting. Our little disagreement in theater number 5 left her somewhat diminished. She'll recover, of course. She always does. You hurt her, Lucy said, understanding dawning. After we left, you turned on her. Hurt is such a limited concept, the entity mused through Ryan's mouth. Let's say I reminded her of our arrangement. She's been growing too independent, too possessive of what is ultimately mine. As it spoke, I noticed something. A faint, regular clicking sound coming from Ryan's pocket. The black box? Had Donna managed to plant it on him before the entity took control? I caught Lucy's eye, trying to communicate my realization without words. She frowned slightly, then her eyes widened as she heard it too. What arrangement? I asked, keeping the entity talking while trying to edge closer. What does Donna get out of serving you? Time, the entity said simply. Extension. Humans are so terribly fragile, so briefly alight before guttering out. Donna's flame has burned for nearly a century now, bright and steady, in exchange for certain considerations. Feeding you people like David, Lucy said bitterly. People like us. Ryan's shoulders shrugged, an eerily normal gesture from the inhuman presence. A small price for such a gift, wouldn't you agree? And now? I lunged forward suddenly, driving my shoulder into Ryan's chest while my hand plunged into his jacket pocket. My fingers closed around something small and cold, the black box vibrating faintly with that rhythmic clicking. The entity shrieked, Ryan's voice distorting into something alien and multi-layered. Hands like claws grabbed at me, inhumanly strong. I staggered back, clutching the device, frantically searching for a switch or button. Lucy, I gasped. The journal. Check if there's anything about how this works. She fumbled with the journal, flipping pages desperately while I struggled to keep the possessed Ryan at bay. The entity was stronger than it should be, given Ryan's relatively slim build. Its movements became increasingly distorted, limbs bending at impossible angles. Here, Lucy cried. Margaret mentions a control device. You have to press the 2 side buttons simultaneously while turning the dial all the way up. I found the buttons, small and recessed on either side of the box. The dial was on top, currently set to a midpoint. As Ryan's form lunged at me again, I pressed the buttons and twisted the dial to maximum. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Ryan's body convulsed, back arching at an impossible angle. A sound emerged from his throat. Not a scream, but a high, keening wail that seemed to come from multiple sources at once. The air around him rippled like heat waves over hot asphalt. "It's hurting him," Lucy cried. "Adrian, it's hurting Ryan." "It's not him," I shouted back, though I shared her horror. "Not anymore." Ryan's body contorted further, his skin rippling as if something beneath was trying to escape. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, a dark mass began to separate from him. An oily, shifting shadow that seemed to bleed from every pore. It hovered around him, formless yet somehow suggesting a feminine silhouette. Ryan collapsed to the floor, gasping. The shadow mass pulsed angrily, tendrils lashing out toward us but unable to bridge the distance while the box continued its high-frequency disruption. "Go!" I shouted to Lucy. "Get Ryan!" "We have to leave now." Lucy darted forward, dragging Ryan's semi-conscious form away from the writhing darkness. Together, we pulled him through the door into the hallway beyond. The shadow entity made one last desperate lunge, a tendril catching my arm. Ice-cold pain shot through me, not physical but emotional. A sudden crushing weight of grief so intense I nearly blacked out. Then we were through, slamming the door shut behind us. The black box continued to vibrate in my hand, its effect apparently diminished by the barrier between us and the entity. From inside, we heard an unearthly howl of rage and frustration. "It won't hold it for long," I gasped, still reeling from that brief contact. "We need to get out of the building." Ryan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They were his own again, the amber glow gone. What happened?" he mumbled. "No time," Lucy said, helping him to his feet. "Can you walk?" He nodded weakly, looking disoriented but present. We half-carried him down the hallway toward the emergency exit, the wailing from the viewing room growing fainter but not disappearing completely. "The box," Ryan slurred, noticing the device in my hand. "Where did you get that?" "Donna must have slipped it into your pocket," I explained as we pushed through the exit into the blinding sunlight of the parking lot. Before whatever that was took control of you." Ryan shuddered, leaning heavily against a parked car. "I remember Donna finding me in the lobby. She seemed scared, said something was wrong in theater number 5, that you two were in danger. Then," he frowned, struggling to recall. "Then nothing. Just darkness and voices. So many voices." Lucy and I exchanged grim looks. "It possessed you," she said gently. "The entity from theater number 5. It was using you to get to us." Ryan's face paled further. What is that thing? Really?" I clutched the journal, which contained partial answers at best. "Something old," I said. "Something that feeds on grief. And Donna's been its curator, for lack of a better word, for decades." "It said she was indisposed," Lucy added, worry creasing her brow. "I think it might have hurt her, or worse." Ryan rubbed his face, still gathering his bearings. "So what now? We can't just leave it in there. If it could take me over, it could do the same to anyone," I finished grimly. "Patrons, staff. It's breaking free of whatever controls Donna established." The black box in my hand had stopped clicking, the battery apparently drained. I pocketed it anyway. It might be useful later if we could figure out how to recharge it. "We need to end this," Lucy said firmly. "Permanently." Ryan looked between us, confusion giving way to grim understanding. "You mean destroy the theater? How? That thing in there. It's not just going to let us burn the place down." "No," I agreed. "But the journal and film might give us some ideas. We need a safe place to study them, to make a plan." Lucy nodded. "My apartment. It's not far from here." As we walked to our respective vehicles, I couldn't help looking back at the Wellington Grand. From the outside, it looked the same as ever, decrepit, forgotten, harmless. But knowing what lurked within its walls, what had been feeding there for decades, made it seem malevolent in a way mere architecture shouldn't be able to achieve. And somewhere inside, Donna Harlow was either dead, captive, or complicit in whatever would happen next. Given her history with the entity, I wasn't sure which possibility was more disturbing. Lucy's apartment was small but meticulously organized, the walls decorated with vintage movie posters protected under glass. None older than 7 days, I noted with grim amusement. The irony of escaping to a place surrounded by film memorabilia wasn't lost on any of us. Ryan collapsed onto Lucy's sofa, still weak from his possession. The experience had left visible marks. His skin was paler than usual, with faint branching patterns like frost on a window tracing his veins. His eyes had lost their amber tint, but the pupils remained dilated, giving him a perpetually startled look. "I feel hollowed out," he murmured as Lucy brought him a glass of water. "Like something scooped out parts of me and didn't put them back right." I nodded sympathetically, though I couldn't truly comprehend what he'd experienced. "Did you see anything while it was controlling you? Anything that might help us understand it better?" Ryan's hands trembled slightly as he sipped the water. "Not see exactly. More like feel. It's ancient, Adrian. Older than the theater. Older than the carnival Margaret wrote about. It felt like grief itself, somehow given form." "A grief eater," Lucy said, sitting across from him. "That's what Margaret called it in her journal. Something that consumes sorrow and despair." "But it's more than that," Ryan insisted, his eyes unfocused as he struggled to articulate his experience. "It doesn't just consume grief. It cultivates it, refines it, like a vintage wine or a rare cheese. The longer the grief ferments, the more potent it becomes as sustenance." I spread Margaret's journal on Lucy's kitchen table, alongside my hastily scribbled notes. "That's why Donna maintains Theater Number 5 as a kind of shrine to Elaine's grief. She's aging it, concentrating it." "But why?" Lucy asked, joining me at the table while Ryan rested. "What does Donna get out of this arrangement? Just longevity?" I flipped through the journal pages, searching for answers. Margaret suspected it was more than that. She writes here about Donna's special relationship with the entity. "Mrs. Harlow seems to derive some essence from it, beyond mere extension of life. There is a vitality to her that waxes and wanes with the feeding cycles of the theater. She's siphoning off energy," Ryan called weakly from the sofa. "I felt that when it was inside me. It doesn't just give her long life, it gives her something else, a kind of power." Lucy frowned. "What kind of power?" "Influence," I suggested, remembering the strange compliance of local authorities, the way the theater had operated for decades despite numerous deaths and disappearances. The ability to make people overlook things they should question, to redirect attention away from the Wellington Grand. "That makes sense," Lucy said. "I've always wondered why the health department never shut us down, or why the police never investigate thoroughly when people go missing." Ryan struggled to a sitting position. "It's more than administrative oversight. When it was in me, I could feel its reach, like tendrils extending out from the theater, touching minds, subtly redirecting thoughts. Donna's harnessed that somehow, focused it to protect the theater's operation." I turned to a page in the journal where Margaret had sketched the black box device, Donna's resonator, as she called it. The drawing showed a simple rectangular object with 2 buttons on the sides and a dial on top, just like the one I'd taken from Ryan's pocket during our desperate flight from Theater Number 5. I reached into my jacket and withdrew the device, comparing it to Margaret's meticulous illustration. They were identical. The same weathered casing, the same precisely placed controls, as though the resonator had remained unchanged through decades of use. Margaret's careful notations around the sketch described its purpose. Frequency modulator, controls entity boundaries. Donna uses it to direct but not command. The device felt unnaturally heavy in my hands, as if its weight came not from physical materials but from the burden of its purpose. Beneath my fingertips the metal was cool, yet somehow alive, like holding the pulse of something ancient and patient. Small scratches marked its surface, a history of use etched into its casing, each mark perhaps representing a moment when Donna had negotiated with the entity, established boundaries, or fed it what it craved. "Can I see it?" Lucy asked, extending her hand tentatively. I passed her the resonator, watching as she turned it over with the same cautious reverence one might show a family heirloom with a complicated legacy. Her fingers traced the dial, careful not to adjust its setting. "It's like holding a piece of the theater itself," she murmured. "Something that exists partly in our world and partly in whatever realm the entity inhabits." Ryan observed from a distance, unwilling to touch the device again after his possession. "When it was controlling me, I could feel that box like a splinter under my skin," he said. "Donna must have slipped it into my pocket as some kind of insurance policy. According to Margaret, Donna uses this to modulate the entity's influence," I explained, carefully placing the resonator on the table. "It doesn't control it exactly, but creates boundaries, like sonic fencing for something that exists partly in sound waves." Lucy leaned closer, her fingers hovering over the device without quite touching it. "So it's not a weapon. It's more like a shepherd's crook, or a conductor's baton," Ryan added softly from the couch. "It doesn't command, it directs." The film canister sat beside the resonator, its contents seemingly inert but carrying its own gravity. I couldn't shake the feeling that the fragment inside was listening to us, recording our words and fears for some future projection. "We need to understand how all these pieces fit together," I said, spreading Margaret's journal pages into a rough timeline. The carnival, the theater's construction, Donna's bargain, Catherine's death, Elaine's transformation. They're all connected, but how? "Maybe there's something here about where it came from originally," Lucy suggested, carefully turning the delicate pages. "If we knew its origins, we might find its weakness." Ryan joined us at the table, moving stiffly, like someone recovering from a profound illness. His fingers trembled as he traced a paragraph in Margaret's elegant script. Local historians mention a traveling show in the 1880s that featured a mesmeric absorber of sorrows. Patrons would sit before a curtained booth and speak of their deepest grief, while an unseen entity behind the veil would consume their pain, leaving them temporarily relieved. Rumors suggest the carnival owner, one Theodore Harlow, eventually disappeared, though his daughter continued the attraction. "Harlow," I breathed. "Donna's ancestor? Or Donna herself," Lucy suggested grimly. "If she's been around since the 1930s, who knows how far back she really goes?" Ryan shuddered visibly. When it was inside me, I saw fragments, memories that weren't mine. A tent lit by oil lamps, a woman in Victorian dress counting coins, a child crying behind a black curtain. He pressed his fingers to his temples. It wasn't always in theaters. It moved from vessel to vessel, always feeding, always growing. And film gave it the perfect medium, I realized. Stories captured on celluloid, emotions concentrated and replayed endlessly. A feast that never ends. Lucy's face paled as she made the connection. That's why unmarked reels are so dangerous. They're not just recordings of films. They're recordings of the entities feeding. They capture the moment of consumption. A silence fell over us as we contemplated the horrifying implications. The Wellington Grand wasn't just haunted. It was a purpose-built feeding ground, designed to cultivate and harvest human emotion in its most concentrated form. And Donna Harlow, whether she was a century-old collaborator or merely the latest in a family line of grief shepherds, had perfected the process. "What I still don't understand," Ryan said after a moment, "is why it's escalating now. If this arrangement has worked for decades, why is the entity breaking the rules? Why did it attack Donna, take control of me?" I frowned, considering. Something must have changed, a disruption in the balance. "David's death," Lucy suggested. "That wasn't planned, was it? He found an unmarked reel and watched it alone, breaking rule number 2. I nodded slowly. And before that, there was Darren answering the phone wrong. Consecutive breaks in protocol. "The rules maintain balance," Ryan murmured. "With each violation, the entity gets a taste of unrefined emotion, raw and immediate, not the carefully aged grief that Donna cultivates. Like giving fine wine to someone who's only had water, then suddenly switching to moonshine." Lucy added. It's developing new appetites. I turned to the final pages of Margaret's journal, where her neat handwriting had grown increasingly frantic. The last entry was dated just days after Elaine's suicide in Theatre Number 5. I believe I have discovered a terrible truth. The entity does not merely feed on grief. It requires it to maintain coherence in our reality. Without a constant supply, it would dissipate, return to whatever dimension spawned it. Donna's bargain isn't just about control or longevity. It's about anchoring the entity here, giving it form and purpose. More disturbing still is my growing suspicion that Catherine's death was no accident. The fire, the specific film that ignited, even Elaine's position in the theater that fateful night, all suggest careful orchestration. Donna needed a grief more profound than any the theater had yet witnessed, a sorrow so pure and endless that it could sustain the entity for decades. I take my leave tomorrow, though I fear it may already be too late for me. Last night I dreamed I was sitting in Theatre Number 5, though I was both audience and performer. On screen was my own life, but frame by frame someone was cutting out the moments of joy, leaving only the sorrows in sequence. I awoke with the taste of celluloid in my mouth and the certainty that I had been marked. If you read this, know that the Wellington Grand can be ended, but not through conventional means. The entity exists in the spaces between moments, in the darkness between frames. To destroy it requires... The entry ended abruptly, the pen having skidded across the page as if Margaret had been interrupted mid-thought. The remaining pages were blank, her final insight lost. She never finished, Lucy whispered, touching the ink trail that marked Margaret's last written word. What was she going to say? How do we destroy it? Ryan leaned back, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. Maybe it can't be destroyed. Maybe it can only be contained, managed. That's what Donna's been doing for decades, I pointed out. And look where it's led. People dead, others missing, and now the entity is breaking free of her control. So what do we do? Lucy asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. I stared at the resonator and film canister, fragments of a system designed to feed and control something ancient and hungry. The answer seemed to hover just beyond reach, like a word on the tip of my tongue. Margaret thought the entity needs grief to maintain form in our reality, I said slowly. What if we starved it? Ryan frowned. How? The theater is practically marinated in decades of sorrow. Not just starve it, I clarified, my thoughts racing ahead. Feed it something it can't digest, something that would act like poison. Lucy's eyes widened. Like what? I hesitated, an idea forming, radical, possibly insane, but with a certain twisted logic. The opposite of grief. Not joy exactly, but resolution, completion. The thing that grief can never have. Ryan and Lucy exchanged skeptical glances. Think about it, I pressed on. The entity feeds on unresolved grief, the endless loop of Elaine mourning Catherine, never finding closure. What if we gave Catherine back to her? That's impossible, Lucy said softly. Catherine died in 1964. But the entity exists partly in film, in images, I argued. What if we created a film that showed Catherine surviving? Not as a deception, but as a completion of their story. An ending that resolves the grief that keeps the entity anchored. Ryan's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious interest. It's mad, but there might be something to it. When the entity was inside me, I felt how it reads emotions. It doesn't distinguish well between real and imagined sorrow. It's the intensity that matters, the purity. So we'd need to create a film powerful enough to convince Elaine's grief that Catherine is at peace, Lucy mused. Something that would complete the cycle rather than perpetuate it. Which means we need to understand exactly what happened in 1964, I said, turning back to the journal. Not just the fire, but what Catherine and Elaine were like, what their relationship was. We need to craft something true enough to resonate. Lucy began gathering the scattered pages, organizing them chronologically. Margaret might have more details we missed, and maybe there are newspaper archives, witnesses still living who remember them. I'll help, Ryan said, though his voice was weak. But I need to rest first. That thing, it took more out of me than I realized. Lucy nodded, guiding him back to the sofa. Sleep. We'll wake you if we find anything important. As Ryan settled into restless slumber, Lucy and I continued our research, combing through Margaret's journal for every mention of Catherine and Elaine. The picture that emerged was heartbreaking in its simplicity. A single mother working concessions to support her daughter, bringing Catherine to work when she couldn't afford childcare. Catherine, by all accounts, had been a bright, imaginative child who loved the movies, often sitting in theater number 5 watching the same film multiple times while her mother worked. Their tragedy wasn't extraordinary, just the mundane horror of a child in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a mother who couldn't reach her in time. Perhaps that very ordinariness made Elaine's grief so potent, so universal. We'll need a script, Lucy said, jotting down notes. Something that acknowledges the truth of what happened but offers the resolution that Elaine never found. I nodded, mind already sketching possibilities. And actors who resemble them. The old publicity photos in Margaret's journal give us something to work from. Lucy hesitated, then asked the question we'd both been avoiding. But how do we actually show this film to the entity? We can't just book theater number 5 and hope it shows up for a screening. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the answer. We'd have to go back, use the resonator to hold it at bay long enough to set up the projector, then hope it works. And if it doesn't? Lucy's voice was barely above a whisper. I had no answer for that. The entity had already demonstrated its growing power, its ability to possess and manipulate. If our plan failed, we would likely join the long list of Wellington Grand casualties. Ryan stirred on the sofa, caught in some troubled dream. His hands twitched, fingers moving as if threading invisible film through a projector. His lips formed words I couldn't quite make out. There's something else we're missing, Lucy said, watching him with concern. Margaret knew how to destroy the entity, or thought she did. Her last entry was cut off right as she was about to explain. I turned back to that final, incomplete paragraph, studying the abrupt ink trail. What if she wasn't interrupted? What if she stopped writing because she realized it was too dangerous to put in words? Lucy frowned. You think the entity can read? I think it can sense when it's threatened, I clarified. Maybe Margaret realized that writing down the method would alert it somehow. Maybe she found another way to preserve the information. A thought struck me. So obvious I was ashamed it had taken so long to surface. The film fragment. We've been assuming it's just evidence of what happened to Catherine. But what if it's more? What if Margaret hid her solution in the footage itself? Lucy's eyes widened. We only watched it once and we were focused on the images. What if there's something in the background, some detail we missed? We both turned to the film canister, sitting innocently on the table. The idea of viewing it again made my skin crawl, remembering the unnatural movements, the way the film itself seemed alive. But if Margaret had hidden the key to destroying the entity within those frames, we had no choice. We'll need a projector, I said. A real one, not a viewing device, and we'll need to go through it frame by frame. Lucy nodded grimly. I know someone who might help, an old film professor who collects vintage equipment. But Adrian, she hesitated, her eyes troubled. What about Donna? If she's still alive in there, still, whatever she is. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Donna Harlow was both victim and collaborator, perhaps the entity's longest-serving enabler. But she had also, in her own twisted way, contained it for decades. If we destroyed the entity, what would happen to her? One problem at a time, I said, though the moral complexity of our situation wasn't lost on me. First, we understand what we're facing. Then we decide what to do about Donna. As the afternoon faded into evening, we continued our research, making lists, sketching timelines, trying to piece together the full history of the Wellington Grand and its hungry resident. Outside, the world continued its normal rhythms, oblivious to the ancient darkness we were probing, the grief that had crystallized into something beyond human understanding. And somewhere across town, the Wellington Grand Theater stood waiting, its marquee flickering in the gathering dusk. advertising classics that no one would come to see, a temple to a hunger that had fed for decades and showed no signs of being sated. Lucy's film professor, an older man named Herbert Malone, lived in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town. The space was a shrine to cinema's analog era. Shelves of film canisters, vintage cameras and projectors, posters from the silent era through the 1970s. The air smelled of celluloid and the faint metallic tang of developing chemicals. Herbert himself was as carefully preserved as his collection, white-haired but spry, with thick glasses and hands stained by decades of handling film stock. He greeted Lucy with genuine warmth and regarded Ryan and me with scholarly curiosity. "Lucy tells me you've discovered something unusual," he said, leading us through his labyrinth of cinematic treasures. A film fragment with unique properties. I exchanged glances with Lucy, uncertain how much Herbert knew or believed. She gave a slight nod, encouraging me to be honest. "It's from the Wellington Grand," I explained. "Preserved by a former employee named Margaret Ellington after the fire in 1964. Herbert's eyebrows rose above his thick frames. "The Catherine Reeves tragedy. I remember it, though I was just a boy. Terrible business." He paused, studying me. "The Wellington has always had a reputation among those who understand film history. Not many theaters can claim to actually consume their audiences." My surprise must have shown on my face because Herbert chuckled dryly. "Young man, when you've been studying cinema as long as I have, you learn that certain venues develop unusual relationships with what they screen. The Grand is merely the most dramatic example." He led us to a small screening room at the back of the warehouse, equipped with several projectors of different vintages. A large magnifying apparatus sat on a rolling table, clearly designed for frame-by-frame analysis. "May I?" Herbert asked, extending his hand for the film canister. I hesitated, remembering how the fragment had affected us when we viewed it. "It's not normal film," I warned. "It might be disturbing." Herbert's eyes twinkled with the enthusiasm of a true collector. "My dear boy, I've handled nitrate stock so volatile it could ignite from a stray thought. I've restored films found in flooded basements covered in mold that gave me hallucinations for weeks. Whatever peculiarities your fragment possesses, I assure you I've seen stranger." His confidence was oddly reassuring. I handed over the canister, which Herbert opened with practiced ease. He carefully extracted the film strip, holding it up to a light panel for preliminary examination. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The emulsion has an unusual iridescence, almost like oil on water, and the frame structure is non-standard." He glanced at us. "This isn't just aged or damaged. It's fundamentally different from conventional film stock." "Can you project it safely?" Ryan asked, hovering nervously by the door as if prepared to bolt at the first sign of trouble. Herbert nodded thoughtfully. "I believe so, though I'd recommend we use the manual crank projector rather than the motorized one. It will give us more control over the speed and allow us to stop on specific frames if needed." He spent several minutes setting up an ancient-looking projector, handling the film with cotton gloves and extraordinary care. As he worked, he asked us questions about the Wellington Grand, its history, the unusual occurrences, the rules that governed its operation. We answered as truthfully as we dared, though we avoided mentioning our direct encounters with the entity. Finally, Herbert dimmed the lights and positioned himself at the projector's hand crank. "Ready?" he asked, glancing at each of us in turn. We nodded, gathering close to the small screen on the wall. Herbert began turning the crank, advancing the film at a deliberate pace, much slower than normal projection speed. The fragment opened with the same images we'd seen before. Theater number 5 with its distorted proportions, the audience facing away from the camera, Donna and young Catherine visible at the edge of the frame. But at this slower speed, new details emerged. The faces in the audience weren't fully formed. They shifted and blurred, as if multiple features were competing for the same space. Some appeared to be weeping, though their tears fell upward, defying gravity. And subtly rendered in the grain of the film itself, almost imperceptible unless you knew to look for it, were symbols. geometric shapes and characters from alphabets I didn't recognize. "There," Herbert said suddenly, stopping the crank. "Do you see it?" He pointed to the corner of the frozen frame, where a small annotation was visible in the film stock itself. Letters scratched directly into the emulsion. "She's left a message," I realized. Margaret scratched words into the film itself. Frame by frame, Herbert advanced the reel, revealing more letters. "Project, reject, witness?" Ryan guessed, piecing the fragments together. Herbert continued the laborious process until we had a complete set of annotations that, when assembled, formed a cryptic instruction. Project reject, whiteness between frames, reverse sequence, bind with love, feed resolution, not grief. "What does it mean?" Lucy asked, copying the message into her notebook. I stared at the words, trying to decipher Margaret's final communication. Project reject could mean to screen something that would be rejected, I suggested. But whiteness between frames. Herbert's eyes lit with understanding. "The interstitial spaces," he said. "In film projection, the brain perceives continuous motion because it fills in the gaps between still frames. But those gaps are actually moments of darkness or, in some projection systems, whiteness. The entity exists in those spaces," Ryan murmured, echoing Margaret's journal. "In the darkness between frames. So we need to project something into those interstitial spaces," Lucy asked. "Is that even possible?" Herbert smiled, the expression of a craftsman asked about his specialty. "With conventional modern projection, no. But with older equipment, modified properly," he gestured to his collection, "it would require a dual projection system, with the second projector specifically calibrated to illuminate only when the first is between frames." "And what would we project?" I asked. "What did Margaret mean by reverse sequence bind with love?" Ryan, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "When the entity was in me, I felt how it thinks. It experiences time differently than we do. Past, present, future. They're not sequential, but simultaneous." His eyes met mine. "What if we need to show Catherine's story backward? Not from life to death, but from death to life. A reverse sequence," Lucy breathed. "Ending with resolution instead of tragedy." "That would be the opposite of what feeds it," I agreed. "Not grief, which spirals endlessly with no conclusion, but completion. An ending that heals rather than wounds." Herbert was watching us with growing interest. "You're not just studying this academically, are you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "You intend to use this information practically?" Lucy glanced at me, a silent question in her eyes. I nodded slightly. Herbert had already demonstrated his understanding of film's stranger properties. If anyone would believe us, it would be him. "The entity in the Wellington Grand is breaking free of its containment," she explained. "It's growing stronger, more aggressive. If we don't stop it, more people will die." Herbert nodded, unsurprised. I suspected as much when I heard about the recent accident. The janitor who died. "You knew David?" Ryan asked. "Not personally, but news travels in small circles." Herbert removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. "The Wellington Grand has claimed victims before. Usually it's more discreet. A missing employee, a patron who never makes it home from a late showing. This recent death was unusually public. It's escalating," I confirmed, breaking the patterns that have contained it for decades. Herbert replaced his glasses, studying us with renewed intensity. "And you believe this message from Margaret Ellington holds the key to stopping it? A specialized projection technique that would somehow neutralize the entity? We think it might give the entity what it truly needs, resolution," Lucy said. "Completion instead of endless consumption. Or it might destroy it entirely," Ryan added quietly. Herbert considered this for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "Then I will help you. But what you're proposing will require specialized equipment, preparations, and of course we'll need to create the film itself. This reverse sequence that offers resolution. We have ideas for the script," I said. "But we'd need actors, a camera." "Leave that to me," Herbert interrupted. His eyes gleaming with the excitement of a true cinephile offered the chance to create something truly unique. I have colleagues, former students who work in independent film, people who would understand the unusual nature of this project. We don't have much time, Lucy warned. The entity is gaining strength, and Donna might be injured or worse. Herbert nodded gravely. Then we'll work quickly, but rushing something like this could be disastrous. The film must be perfect, emotionally resonant enough to affect something that feeds on the purest distillations of human grief. As Herbert began making calls to his contacts, I pulled Lucy and Ryan aside. Are we sure about this? I asked quietly. Involving more people, creating an actual film, it's risky, and we're still assuming Margaret's message is the solution. Do we have a choice? Lucy countered. The entity is breaking free. We've seen what it can do, what it wants. If we wait, it'll only get stronger. Ryan nodded, though fear still shadowed his eyes. And Herbert seems to know what he's doing. If anyone can help us create what Margaret described, it's him. A soft chime from Lucy's phone interrupted our huddle. She checked the screen, her face paling. What is it? I asked. An email from work, she said, voice tight. The theater's closed for renovations, effective immediately. All staff are being given paid leave until further notice. Ryan and I exchanged alarmed glances. Donna never closes for renovations, he said. Never. It's not Donna sending this, Lucy confirmed grimly. Look at the signature. She turned her phone so we could see the screen. The email was signed not by Donna Harlow, but by Management Wellington Grand Enterprises. The entity, I whispered. It's taking control of the theater's operations, which means Donna is either gone or no longer in charge, Ryan added. Lucy slipped her phone back into her pocket, her expression hardening with resolve. Then we have less time than we thought. Herbert needs to work fast. I glanced back at the film professor, who was deep in conversation with someone on his phone, gesturing animatedly as he explained his needs. His enthusiasm was undeniable, but I couldn't help wondering if we were placing too much faith in Margaret's cryptic message, in our interpretation of what the entity truly was. What if we were wrong? What if our attempt to feed it resolution instead of grief only made it stronger or angrier? What if the Wellington Grand had been containing something far worse than we realized, and our interference would release it entirely? But the alternative, doing nothing, allowing the entity to continue its predation unchecked, was unthinkable. David was already dead. Donna might be as well. How many more would fall victim before someone took action? As if reading my thoughts, Lucy placed a hand on my arm. We're doing the right thing, Adrian. Maybe the only thing we can do. I nodded, hoping she was right. In the dim light of Herbert's screening room, with the strange film fragment still loaded in the projector and Margaret's cryptic message hanging in the air between us, the path forward seemed simultaneously clear and shrouded in uncertainty. We would create a film to heal a grief so profound it had become sentient. We would project it into the spaces between moments, the white voids where the entity lurked, and we would hope that Margaret Ellington, decades dead, had discovered a truth powerful enough to end the Wellington Grand's long, hungry reign. Herbert moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime handling film emergencies. Within hours, he had assembled a small team of trusted collaborators, a cinematographer named Ellis, who specialized in analog techniques, a young actress named Maya with an uncanny resemblance to Catherine Reeves, and a middle-aged woman named Valerie who would play Elaine. None of them knew the full truth about the Wellington Grand. Herbert had explained it as an experimental film project, a metaphysical exploration of grief and resolution. The unusual projection techniques and rushed timeline were framed as artistic choices rather than desperate measures against a hungry entity. They don't need to understand everything, Herbert explained when I questioned this partial deception. They just need to believe in the emotional truth of what we're creating. The entity will respond to authenticity, not to their intellectual grasp of the situation. We converted Herbert's warehouse into an impromptu film set, constructing a rough approximation of Theater Number 5 based on Ryan's memories and Margaret's descriptions. Ellis worked with ancient equipment, a 16mm camera that Herbert insisted would capture imagery with the particular texture we needed. The script Lucy and I developed was deceptively simple. Catherine's final day shown in reverse. Beginning with the aftermath of the fire, Elaine's grief, the community's mourning, and moving backward through the day until we reached a quiet morning scene of mother and daughter sharing breakfast, full of life and possibility. The key is the emotional arc, Lucy explained to the actors during a brief rehearsal. We're not just reversing time, we're reversing grief itself, moving from despair to hope, from loss to presence. Valerie, who had lost a child herself years earlier, needed no instruction on portraying a grieving mother. Her performance during the initial scenes was so raw, so authentic, that we had to pause filming several times to compose ourselves. It's strange, she commented during a break, unaware of the true purpose of our project. Usually when you play grief, you build toward the moment of loss. But we're doing the opposite, moving from the depths of sorrow toward normality. It feels almost healing. That's exactly what we're aiming for, I said, trying not to reveal how pivotal her observation was. Resolution instead of endless grief. Maya, the young actress playing Catherine, approached her role with an intuitive understanding that belied her age. I'm playing someone who doesn't know she's already gone, she explained when Herbert praised her performance. She's just living her life, moment by moment, unaware of what's happened or will happen. The filming process was exhausting but strangely cathartic. We worked through the night, capturing each scene with meticulous attention to emotional detail. Herbert insisted on multiple takes, searching for moments of genuine connection between the actors that transcended performance. While Herbert and Ellis handled the filming, Ryan and I focused on the technical challenge of the specialized projection system. Following Margaret's instructions, we needed to modify 2 projectors to work in perfect synchronization, one showing our film normally, the other projecting supplementary images into the white spaces between frames. These interstitial images are the key, Herbert explained as we worked. They won't be consciously perceived by human viewers, but the entity experiences time differently. It will see both simultaneously. For these critical interstitial frames, we created a sequence of images symbolizing completion and resolution, photographs of mothers and children reunited after separation, iconic film scenes of reconciliation, and abstract imagery of circles closing and broken things being mended. It's like visual poetry, Ryan observed as we assembled the sequence. A subliminal message of wholeness. By dawn, we had a rough cut of our film, 20 minutes of reverse chronology storytelling that began with devastating loss and ended with quiet domestic joy. Herbert and Ellis worked feverishly to process the footage, developing it in chemical baths that Herbert had augmented with substances he refused to name. Old projectionist tricks, was all he would say when I asked. Chemicals that make the emulsion more receptive to certain frequencies. As they worked, Lucy pulled me aside, her face drawn with exhaustion, but eyes bright with urgency. I got another email from management, she said quietly. The renovations at the Wellington are complete. They're reopening tonight with a special screening in theater number 5. My blood ran cold. What are they showing? Lucy's hands trembled slightly as she showed me her phone. That's the thing. The email didn't specify a film. It just said, a reunion will be screened at midnight. It's luring people in, Ryan said, having overheard our conversation. Fresh emotions to feed on. Or it's looking for us, I suggested grimly. It knows we've discovered something. Maybe it can sense what we're planning. Herbert joined us, wiping chemical-stained hands on a cloth. The film will be ready by sunset, he announced. But deploying it will be dangerous. The entity won't simply sit back and allow itself to be transformed. We'll need a distraction, Lucy said, thinking aloud. Something to occupy it while we set up the projectors. Ryan's face paled, but his voice was steady. I could draw its attention. It's been inside me once already. It might be interested in reconnecting. I shook my head firmly. Absolutely not. We go together or not at all. There might be another way, Herbert suggested. A preliminary projection, something to capture its interest without revealing our true purpose. Like what? Lucy asked. Herbert's eyes gleamed behind his thick glasses. Archives from the Wellington's early days. I have footage from the 1930s and 40s, ordinary screenings, patrons coming and going. To the entity, it would be like looking in a mirror, seeing itself in its younger days. A nostalgic distraction, I mused. It might work, but we still need to get into the theater, set up the equipment without being detected, Ryan pointed out. And we have no idea what state the place is in now, or what's happened to Donna. Lucy straightened her shoulders, decision crystallizing in her eyes. I'll call in sick to work, ask for updates from whoever's running things now. Pretend I don't know about the renovations email. Maybe I can get information on who's managing the place. It was a risk, but our options were limited. While Lucy made her call, stepping outside for privacy, Herbert, Ryan, and I finalized our preparations. The modified projectors were loaded into Herbert's van, along with our specially processed film and the nostalgic distraction footage. Lucy returned looking shaken. I spoke to someone I've never heard before, a man who called himself Mr. Wellington. Said he was the new operations manager, effective immediately. Did he explain what happened to Donna? I asked. Lucy shook her head. When I asked, he just said Ms. Harlow has taken a well-deserved retirement. His voice was wrong somehow, like multiple people speaking in unison, just slightly out of sync. The entity, Ryan whispered. It's not just influencing the theater anymore. It's running it directly. Then we're running out of time, Herbert said gravely. If it's manifesting strongly enough to make phone calls to pose as management, then the boundaries between its realm and ours are dangerously thin. We spent the remaining daylight hours refining our plan. Herbert would handle the technical aspects of the projection, with Ellis assisting. Ryan, Lucy, and I would enter the theater first, scouting the situation and creating a diversion if necessary to allow Herbert and Ellis to bring in the equipment. The rendezvous was set for 11 p.m., 1 hour before the mysterious reunion screening. As dusk fell and Herbert's team made their final preparations, an uncomfortable question surfaced in my mind. What about the actors? I asked quietly. Valerie and Maya? Should we warn them about what their performances might be used for? Herbert considered this, then shook his head. Their performances were genuine, untainted by knowledge of the entity. That authenticity is crucial. Telling them now would only place them in danger, both from the entity itself and from the burden of such knowledge. I nodded, understanding his logic but still uncomfortable with the deception. Maya and Valerie had given pieces of themselves to our film, emotional truths that we would use as weapons against something ancient and hungry. They deserved to know, yet knowing might harm them in ways we couldn't predict. As we loaded the last of the equipment, I found myself standing alone with Herbert near his van. The old professor seemed energized by our desperate project, years falling away as he checked and double-checked the modified projectors. You've encountered things like this before, haven't you? I asked quietly. This isn't just academic knowledge for you. Herbert paused, his hand stilling on an old film canister. For a moment, I thought he might deny it, but then he smiled, a sad, knowing expression. Cinema has always been a kind of magic, Adrian. The ability to capture time, to preserve moments that would otherwise be lost forever. He adjusted his glasses, looking past me into some distant memory. And like all magic, it attracts attention from places beyond ordinary understanding. The Wellington Grand isn't unique, is it? Herbert shook his head. No, merely the most pronounced example I've encountered. There are others. Theaters where time moves strangely, where emotions linger long after the audience has departed. Places where the boundary between the story on screen and the reality of the viewers becomes permeable. And you've helped deal with them before? A shadow crossed Herbert's face. Once, a small art house cinema in Portland that had developed a habit of retaining certain patrons. I was younger then, less prepared. We managed to close it down, but not without casualties. The admission sent a chill through me. Herbert wasn't just an eccentric film professor. He was a veteran of battles I hadn't known existed until days ago. Why didn't you tell us? I asked. Would you have believed me? He countered gently. Or would you have seen me as just another crazy old man with fantastical stories? You needed to discover the truth in your own way, come to your own understanding of what you face. Before I could respond, Lucy and Ryan approached, their faces set with grim determination. The time for planning was over. Whatever awaited us at the Wellington Grand, whatever had taken Donna's place and now called itself Mr. Wellington, would soon face a confrontation decades in the making. As we drove through the darkening streets toward the theater, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading into something far more complex than a simple exorcism. The entity had been part of the Wellington Grand for generations, symbiotically entwined with the building's very existence. Removing it wouldn't just cleanse the theater. It might fundamentally alter its reality in ways we couldn't predict. And somewhere in that warped space, Donna Harlow, keeper, enabler, and possible victim, awaited whatever resolution we could offer. Whether she deserved rescue or justice remained to be seen. The Wellington Grand looked different as we approached it that night. The decrepit facade seemed subtly altered, the brick more vibrant, the marquee brighter, the neon sign humming with an electric vitality I'd never noticed before. It was as if the building had shed decades of decay overnight, drawing energy from some unseen source. The parking lot held a dozen or so cars, more than I'd ever seen during my brief employment. Silhouettes moved behind the glass lobby doors, patrons gathering for the midnight screening. "People are actually coming," Lucy whispered as we parked across the street, observing from a safe distance. "How is that possible? This place never draws crowds." "It's calling them," Ryan said, his voice tight, like a spider drawing flies. Herbert and Ellis had parked their equipment van 2 blocks away, waiting for our signal that it was safe to approach. We needed to assess the situation first, determine who or what was running the theater now, and whether Donna was still present in some capacity. "Remember the plan," I said quietly. "We go in as customers, scout the layout, check for changes. At 11:30, I'll text Herbert to bring in the equipment through the service entrance. We'll create a distraction if necessary." Lucy nodded, though her face was pale. "And if the entity recognizes us?" "It almost certainly will," Ryan said grimly. "The question is what it will do about it." We crossed the street, approaching the theater with forced casualness. Up close, the changes were even more pronounced. The lobby windows gleamed, free of the grime that had accumulated over decades. The carpet, once threadbare and stained, appeared freshly installed, a rich burgundy pattern that seemed to shift subtly underfoot. Inside, the lobby bustled with activity. Concession stands fully stocked, lights bright and steady, no sign of the constant electrical issues that had plagued the building. Behind the counter stood a tall man in an impeccable suit, his back to us as he arranged candy displays with meticulous precision. "Is that him?" I murmured to Lucy. "Mr. Wellington?" Before she could answer, the man turned, and my breath caught in my throat. He was handsome in a conventional way. Dark hair, strong jaw, pleasant smile. But his eyes were wrong. They reflected the light oddly, like polished celluloid rather than living tissue, and their color seemed to shift subtly from brown to amber to gray as he moved. "Welcome to the Wellington Grand," he said, his voice resonant and slightly echoing, as if multiple speakers were projecting the same words with millisecond delays between them. "So pleased you could join us for tonight's special presentation." His gaze moved over our small group, lingering on each face. When he reached me, his smile widened fractionally. "Adrian Hale. How wonderful. I wasn't sure you'd accept our invitation." Ice formed in my veins. "I don't recall receiving one." Mr. Wellington laughed, a sound like film rattling through a projector. "Didn't you? I believe we've been calling to you since your first day. Some hear more clearly than others." His attention shifted to Ryan, whose face had gone ashen. "You certainly did, didn't you, Ryan? Such a receptive vessel." Ryan swallowed hard but said nothing. "And Lucy," the man continued, his gaze softening artificially, "still carrying all that worry for your sister. Such refined sorrow, subtle notes of guilt, fear, love, exquisite." Lucy's hand found mine, squeezing tightly. "Tonight's showing will begin at midnight precisely," Mr. Wellington announced. addressing us but projecting his voice to include the other patrons milling about the lobby. A truly special presentation, a reunion of sorts. His strange eyes fixed on me again. Theater number 5. I do hope you'll attend. With that, he turned away, moving with unnatural smoothness toward the ticket booth. The other patrons seemed oblivious to his strangeness, chatting among themselves with the excited anticipation of people attending a premiere rather than a midnight showing at a decrepit small-town theater. "That's not a person," Lucy whispered once he was out of earshot. "It's the entity, wearing a human shape." Ryan nodded, trembling slightly. "I can feel it, like static electricity on my skin. It's stronger than before, more coherent." I glanced around the lobby, noting other changes. The posters on the walls were all for films I'd never heard of, with unsettling titles. The Endless Morning, Children of Sorrow, Whispers Between Frames. The dates on them spanned decades, from the 1940s to films supposedly releasing next year. "Where's Donna?" Lucy wondered aloud, scanning the busy lobby. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we need to check the projection booth, make sure we can access it for Herbert." We moved through the crowd, trying to appear casual while studying every detail of the altered theater. The patrons themselves were worth noting, ordinary people of various ages, but all with a certain detachment in their expressions, as if sleepwalking through a pleasant dream. None seemed to notice the strange posters or question Mr. Wellington's uncanny presence. The hallway leading to the individual theaters remained largely unchanged, though the lighting was steadier than I remembered. Theater number 5's door stood open. No more closed sign, no warning to stay away. Inside, seats had been replaced, the screen repaired, all signs of decades of neglect erased overnight. "This is impossible," Lucy breathed. "No renovation crew could do this in 2 days." "It's not renovation," Ryan said. "It's transformation. The entity is reshaping the physical space to match its ideal form." I checked my watch, 11:20. 10 minutes until we needed to signal Herbert. "We need to check the projection booth, make sure our plan will still work." The booth access was through the same unmarked door at the back of theater number 5. To my surprise, it was unlocked. We climbed the narrow stairs cautiously, expecting to encounter resistance or traps. The projection booth had undergone the same impossible renovation as the rest of the theater. Gone was the ancient, failing equipment, replaced by a state-of-the-art digital projector gleaming under spotless lights. The old analog projector had been pushed to the side, seemingly preserved as a relic rather than discarded. "This complicates things," I murmured. "Herbert's plan requires analog projection." Lucy crossed to the older projector, examining it closely. "It still seems functional. We might be able to bypass the digital system, use this instead." Ryan, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly stiffened. "Someone's coming," he whispered. We froze, listening. Footsteps on the stairs, light but deliberate. I gestured frantically for Lucy and Ryan to hide behind the bulky equipment, then positioned myself near the door, ready to create a distraction if necessary. The door swung open, and I found myself face to face with Donna Harlow. She looked both the same and profoundly different. Her features were unchanged, but her posture was straighter, her movements more fluid. The perpetual exhaustion that had marked her face was gone, replaced by a serene alertness that was somehow more disturbing. "Adrian," she said, her voice carrying the same subtle echo as Mr. Wellington's. "I thought I might find you here. Curious as ever." I struggled to maintain my composure. "Donna, I heard you'd retired." She smiled, the expression not reaching her eyes. "In a manner of speaking, let's call it a transition to an advisory role." She stepped fully into the booth, closing the door behind her. "I assume Lucy and Ryan are here too. No need to hide, children. I've been expecting all of you." Lucy and Ryan emerged reluctantly from their hiding places. Donna regarded them with the detached interest of a scientist observing specimens. "You're not Donna," Lucy said flatly. "Not anymore." Perceptive, Donna, or whatever wore her form, acknowledged, but not entirely accurate. "I am Donna Harlow, just expanded, enlightened." The barriers between myself and the essence of the Wellington Grand have dissolved. You've been possessed, Ryan said, voice shaking. Like I was. Donna shook her head. Possession implies unwillingness, resistance. This was the culmination of a journey begun decades ago, a merging freely chosen. Why? I asked, genuinely curious despite our dire situation. Why would you choose this? Donna, or the entity wearing her, moved to the projection window, gazing down at theater number 5 with evident satisfaction. You've seen this building's history through Margaret's limited perspective. She understood the hunger but not the purpose. And what is the purpose? Lucy pressed. Preservation, Donna said simply. The Wellington Grand doesn't merely consume grief. It preserves it, honors it, gives it meaning. In a world determined to forget its losses, to medicate away its sorrows, we maintain the sanctity of remembrance. The philosophy was twisted but carried a perverse logic that sent chills down my spine. By turning grief into something that feeds on the grieving, I countered. By trapping people like Elaine in endless loops of sorrow. Donna turned, her eyes reflecting the same celluloid quality as Mr. Wellington's. Elaine chose her path, just as I chose mine. Her love for Catherine was so profound, so pure, that she preferred eternal grief to acceptance and forgetting. She remains with her daughter, in her own way. By feeding on others, Ryan said bitterly. By possessing people like me, killing people like David. Unfortunate necessities, Donna admitted without remorse. The preservation of true grief requires sustenance. I checked my watch surreptitiously, 11:35. Herbert would be wondering why we hadn't signaled. We needed to act soon before midnight's mysterious reunion began. And tonight's special screening? I asked, stalling. What exactly are you reuniting? Donna's smile widened, revealing teeth too perfect, too white. Everything comes full circle, Adrian. The Wellington Grand began with a specific hunger, a particular grief. Tonight we honor our origins by recreating them. A cold understanding dawned. You're going to sacrifice someone, create a new grief to feed on. Sacrifice is such a loaded term, Donna chided. Think of it as commissioning a new masterpiece of emotion. The audience downstairs has been carefully selected. People with deep capacity for empathy, for vicarious suffering. When they witness tonight's feature presentation, their collective response will sustain the Wellington for decades. Lucy had been slowly reaching for her phone, presumably to text Herbert a warning. Donna noticed the movement and tutted softly. I wouldn't, she advised. Your professor friend and his assistant are already being escorted inside. Such interesting equipment they brought with them. Modified projectors, specially processed film. Almost as if they planned to override tonight's scheduled presentation. My heart sank. Herbert and Ellis had been caught. Our plan was unraveling before it could begin. You knew we were coming, Ryan realized. You've been watching us all along. Of course, Donna confirmed. The Wellington sees all grief, all fear. Your little research project with Margaret's journal, your consultations with Professor Malone. Such fascinating efforts, if fundamentally misguided. She moved toward us with that same unnatural smoothness, her form seeming to glide rather than walk. But I'm not unsympathetic to your concerns. You've shown remarkable insight, remarkable dedication. There could be a place for you here, a purpose worthy of your talents. What are you suggesting? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Join us, Donna said simply. Become part of the Wellington's legacy. Help us preserve the sacred language of grief. Ensure it's never forgotten or diminished. By feeding people to it? Lucy asked incredulously. By maintaining this abattoir of emotions? Donna's expression hardened slightly. Your alternative is what? To destroy something ancient and necessary? To obliterate a force that has given meaning to countless sorrows over generations? She focused on me specifically. Adrian, you understand loss. The friend you couldn't save. The dreams that died with him. Wouldn't you prefer that grief be honored rather than forgotten? For a moment, just a moment, I felt the pull of her twisted logic. What was modern society's approach to grief but a rush to medicate it away, to move on, to replace authentic sorrow with shallow distractions. Didn't something as profound as true loss deserve preservation, commemoration? But then I remembered David's dying words, the terror in his eyes. I remembered Ryan's hollow expression after the entity had used him and discarded him. This wasn't preservation. It was predation, a parasitic relationship masquerading as reverence. No, I said firmly. Grief isn't meant to be permanent. It's not meant to feed something else. It's meant to be processed, integrated, survived. Donna's face showed genuine disappointment. I had hoped you might understand. But perhaps a demonstration will prove more persuasive. She glanced at her watch, an antique timepiece that seemed to tick slightly off rhythm. It's nearly midnight. The reunion is about to begin. Before any of us could react, the door to the projection booth burst open. Mr. Wellington stood there, flanked by what appeared to be ordinary theater patrons, except their eyes now displayed the same reflective quality as his and Donna's. Our guests of honor have arrived, Mr. Wellington announced, his multi-layered voice reverberating in the small space. Please escort them to their reserved seats. The patron vessels moved forward with mechanical precision, grabbing our arms with surprising strength. I struggled, but the grip on my biceps was implacable, the fingers digging in with inhuman force. Don't resist, Donna advised calmly. It will only make the experience more unpleasant. We were marched down the stairs, through theater number 5, and toward the front row where 3 seats had been left conspicuously empty. The theater was now full of patrons, all sitting with unnatural stillness, eyes fixed on the blank screen. In the center aisle I spotted Herbert and Ellis, similarly escorted by patron vessels. Herbert caught my eye briefly, his expression conveying both apology and a strange determination. Ellis looked simply terrified, a man who had signed up for an experimental film project and found himself in the midst of cosmic horror. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Wellington announced from the front of the theater, welcome to tonight's special presentation, A Reunion of Sorrows. We are particularly honored to have with us several guests who have contributed, knowingly or unknowingly, to this historic evening. The lights dimmed gradually, the screen illuminating with a soft, pulsing glow. I strained against my captors, but their grip remained unyielding. Beside me, Lucy and Ryan were similarly restrained. Before we begin, Mr. Wellington continued, a brief acknowledgement of the Wellington Grand's long tradition of preserving authentic emotion. For decades, this theater has served as a sanctuary for grief in its purest form, a place where sorrow is not pathologized but honored. The screen behind him began to display images, photographs of the theater through the decades, interspersed with faces I recognized from the employee records, people who had disappeared, been fed to the entity. Tonight, Mr. Wellington proclaimed, we return to our roots, a recreation of the catalyst that transformed the Wellington Grand from a mere venue into a living monument to grief's power. The images on screen changed, showing photos of Catherine and Elaine Reeves, mother and daughter, smiling in happier times. Then footage I recognized from the film fragment Margaret had preserved, the projection booth fire, Catherine's silhouette against the flames. The profound grief of a mother for her child has sustained us for generations, Mr. Wellington explained to the rapt audience. Tonight, we honor that legacy by creating a new founding sorrow, a new wellspring of emotion to nourish the Wellington for decades to come. With theatrical timing, he gestured to the back of the theater. The doors opened, and 2 more patron vessels entered, dragging between them a struggling figure, a young woman I didn't recognize. This is Claire Martin, Mr. Wellington announced, sister to our own Lucy Martin, currently in remission from the cancer that has consumed the last 3 years of her life, and much of the Martin family's financial resources. Lucy let out a strangled cry, straining against her captors with renewed desperation. No, leave her alone, she has nothing to do with this. Claire looked up at the sound of her sister's voice, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Lucy, what's happening? Who are these people? Mr. Wellington smiled benevolently. A reunion, as promised, sister with sister. But brief, I'm afraid. He turned to the audience. Witness, friends, witnessed the birth of grief in its purest form, the loss of someone believed saved, the hope extinguished at the moment of its greatest brightness. Understanding crashed over me like ice water. This was the reunion the entity had planned. Not just a screening, but a live recreation of Catherine's death, with Lucy forced to watch her sister die just as Elaine had watched Catherine perish. "Stop this," I shouted, my voice lost among the murmurs of the entranced audience. "This is murder." "This is art," Donna corrected, appearing beside Mr. Wellington. The creation of emotion so profound it transcends ordinary experience. Claire was dragged struggling toward the screen, toward a small door beside it that I'd never noticed before. A door that presumably led to the space behind the screen where the old speaker systems were housed. A space that could easily become an inferno with the right accelerant. Lucy sobbed, her entire body shaking with desperate effort to break free and reach her sister. Ryan and I renewed our struggles, but the patron vessels holding us might as well have been made of stone for all they yielded. As Claire was pushed through the door, her frightened eyes locked with Lucy's across the theater. In that moment, I saw the same look that must have passed between Elaine and Catherine in 1964. The helpless horror of separation at the moment of greatest danger. But then something unexpected happened. Herbert, who had been kneeling submissively between his captors, suddenly produced something from his sleeve, a small metal object that gleamed in the dim theater light. With surprising agility for his age, he twisted and plunged the object into the leg of one of the patron vessels holding him. The effect was immediate and shocking. The patron vessel convulsed, its form rippling as if momentarily losing cohesion. A high, thin sound emanated from it. Not quite a scream, but something more fundamental, like reality itself being punctured. In the moment of confusion, Herbert broke free, shouting to Ellis, "Now!" Ellis, who had apparently been waiting for this signal, pulled something from his jacket, a small, compact projector, battery-powered and preloaded. He aimed it at the main screen and pressed a button. The images of Catherine and Elaine vanished, replaced by a blinding white light that filled the theater. The patron vessels recoiled, their grips loosening just enough for me to wrench free. Around us, the audience members began to stir from their trance-like state, blinking in confusion. "What is this?" Donna demanded, her voice losing its harmonious quality, becoming discordant and ragged. Herbert stood tall, facing her with the confidence of someone who had planned for this moment. "A little something called interstitial disruption," he announced, projecting pure white light at precisely the frequency that disrupts the entity's perception between frames. Mr. Wellington moved toward Herbert with inhuman speed, but Ellis adjusted the projector, focusing the light directly on him. His form seemed to blur, outlines becoming indistinct, as if the light was erasing him pixel by pixel. "Lucy, Adrian, Ryan," Herbert called. "Get to the projection booth. The film is in the black case." I grabbed Lucy, who was already rushing toward her sister. "We have to show the film first," I insisted. "It's the only way to stop this permanently." She hesitated, torn between immediate rescue and long-term solution. Ryan had already broken free and was sprinting toward the booth stairs. "Go!" Herbert shouted again as more patron vessels converged on him and Ellis. "We'll hold them as long as we can." With a last agonized look at her sister, Lucy turned and followed me toward the projection booth. Behind us, chaos erupted as the audience members, freed from their trance, began to panic and flee. Donna and Mr. Wellington seemed to be experiencing some kind of breakdown, their forms flickering between human appearance and something more abstract, geometric, wrong. We reached the booth to find Ryan already loading our specially processed film into the old analog projector. His hands moved with surprising confidence, threading the delicate stock through the complicated path of rollers and gates. "Herbert showed me how," he explained, seeing my surprise. "Just in case." Lucy secured the door behind us, though I doubted it would hold for long against whatever was happening below. Through the projection window, I could see Herbert and Ellis backing toward the exit, still wielding their disruptive light against the advancing forms of Donna, Mr. Wellington, and several patron vessels. "Claire," Lucy said urgently, "we need to get her out." "The film first," I insisted, helping Ryan make the final adjustments to the projector. "It's our only chance to end this. To save everyone, including Claire." The projector hummed to life, the first frames of our reverse chronology story illuminating the screen below. The opening image, Elaine, played by Valerie, standing before a child's gravestone, her face etched with the raw edges of fresh grief. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Donna and Mr. Wellington froze, their attention captured by the familiar scene. The patron vessels likewise paused in their advance, heads turning in unison toward the screen. "It's working," Ryan breathed. "They're connecting with it." Our film continued its reverse journey through grief, scenes of Elaine packing away Catherine's toys becoming scenes of her holding those same toys, crying becoming laughing, funeral flowers becoming garden blooms. Each transition moved backward through sorrow toward joy, toward the wholeness that existed before loss. Below us, something extraordinary was happening. As the film progressed, the forms of Donna and Mr. Wellington became increasingly unstable, not dissolving exactly, but shifting, losing definition at the edges. The patron vessels seemed to be returning to normal, confusion replacing the blank compliance in their expressions. And most remarkably, a new figure was manifesting near the screen. The translucent, shimmering shape of a woman in 1960s dress, her face half burnt but recognizable from the photographs. Elaine Reeves herself, the original grief that had sustained the entity for decades. She stood transfixed by the images on screen, her damaged face registering emotions that seemed too complex, too human for a mere manifestation of sorrow. As the film reached its midpoint, Catherine, played by Maya, running laughing through a park, Elaine chasing her with open arms, the ghostly figure began to change. The burnt side of her face seemed to heal, frame by frame, synchronizing with the reverse progression of our film. Her posture straightened, the twisted agony of eternal grief gradually replaced by something lighter, more open. "It's working," Lucy whispered in awe. Margaret was right. The doors at the back of Theater Number 5 burst open, and more people fled, no longer held in thrall by the entity's influence. Herbert and Ellis used the confusion to make their way toward the door where Claire had been taken, presumably to rescue her while the entity was distracted. Our film approached its conclusion. The final scene showing Catherine and Elaine at breakfast on the morning of the tragedy, sunlight streaming through windows, both faces alive with ordinary joy and possibility. As the last frames played, something remarkable happened to the ghostly figure of Elaine. She smiled, a full, unburnt, radiant smile that transformed her entire being. Her gaze moved from the screen to the spot beside her, where a new, smaller figure was materializing. A young girl in a simple dress, hand extended toward her mother. Catherine, not as she had died, but as she had lived, whole, bright, beloved. The ghostly Elaine knelt, embracing her daughter's form. The light around them intensified, not the hungry flicker of consuming flames, but something cleaner, more complete. They held each other as the film ended, the screen going white, then dark. In that moment of darkness, a sound filled the theater. Not a scream or a moan, but a sigh. A long, releasing exhalation, as if something held tense for decades was finally allowed to relax. When the emergency lights flickered on, Donna and Mr. Wellington were gone. Where they had stood were piles of what looked like gray ash, mixed with fragments of celluloid that caught the light like dying embers. The patron vessels had returned fully to their human forms, confused and disoriented but apparently unharmed. And near the screen, where the ghostly figures of Elaine and Catherine had embraced, there was nothing. No ash, no fragments, just an empty space that somehow felt cleaner, lighter than the rest of the theater. "They're gone," Ryan said in disbelief. "Really gone." Before we could fully process what had happened, the door to the projection booth shuddered under a heavy impact. We tensed, preparing for a final confrontation. But when it swung open, Herbert stood there, supporting a shaken but very much alive Claire Martin. "Lucy," Claire cried, breaking free of Herbert's support to embrace her sister. They clung to each other, both weeping with the simple relief of survival and reunion. Herbert caught my eye over their shoulders, his expression grave but satisfied. "It worked," he confirmed. "The entity has been resolved. Not destroyed exactly, but completed. The cycle of grief that anchored it here has been closed. And Donna? I asked. The real Donna? Herbert shook his head sadly. Gone, I'm afraid. She was too deeply merged with the entity by the end. When it found completion, she could not survive separately. I felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. Relief that the danger had passed. Sadness for a woman who had been both victim and enabler of something monstrous. And a lingering unease about the moral ambiguity of what we had done. Had we destroyed something ancient and necessary, as Donna had claimed? Or had we freed countless souls from a parasitic cycle? As we made our way carefully down from the projection booth through the now empty Theater Number 5, the Wellington Grand itself seemed to be changing. The impossible renovations were fading, the building reverting to its true decrepit state. Plaster crumbled from the walls, revealing the aged structure beneath. The screen, so pristine minutes ago, now showed rips and water damage accumulated over decades. Outside, the neon marquee flickered one last time, then went dark. The building seemed to sag, as if whatever force had been holding it together had finally relented. What happens now? Lucy asked, her arm still around her bewildered sister. Herbert surveyed the darkened theater with the measured gaze of someone who had seen similar endings before. Now, it becomes just a building again. Old, forgotten, probably scheduled for demolition once people realize no one's maintaining it anymore. And the rules? Ryan asked, his voice steadier than it had been in days. The woman in Theater Number 5, the unmarked reels, all of it. Just memories, Herbert assured him. Painful ones perhaps, but no longer dangerous. The hunger that gave them power has been satisfied. As we stood in the empty parking lot, watching the Wellington Grand settle into ordinary decay, I thought about Margaret Ellington's final, incomplete journal entry. The entity exists in the spaces between moments, in the darkness between frames. To destroy it requires, not destruction, I realized, completion. The filling of empty spaces with resolution rather than endless sorrow. Margaret had understood that the entity's hunger could never be satisfied through feeding, only through healing the original wound that had given it form. In the early dawn light, as Ellis called the police to deal with the confused patrons still wandering the premises, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my friend's death, a sense of purpose fulfilled, of something broken made whole. Not perfect, not unmarked by its history of damage, but complete in its own way. Like grief itself, not something to be endlessly preserved in amber, but a journey to be honored, integrated, and eventually gently closed. 3 months after the fall of the Wellington Grand, I stood with Lucy and Ryan watching as demolition crews swarmed over the condemned building. The theater had been declared structurally unsound after mysterious settling caused significant damage to the foundation. No one questioned this explanation. It was easier to accept than the truth. Claire stood a short distance away, fully recovered from her ordeal and miraculously still in remission from the cancer that had nearly claimed her. She remembered little of that night, which was probably a blessing. Hard to believe it's really over, Lucy said softly, watching as workers removed the letters from the marquee one by one. That it was real at all. Ryan nodded, absently rubbing his arms where the ghostly patterns had finally faded. Sometimes I wake up thinking I'm back there, that it's all starting over. But it's just ordinary nightmares now. Those fade too, I assured him, though my own dreams were still occasionally haunted by images of Donna merging with the entity, becoming something neither human nor monster, but a strange hybrid born of decades of compromise. Herbert had returned to his warehouse and his film collection, though he kept in regular contact. The experience had created a bond between us that transcended ordinary friendship, a shared understanding of cinema's stranger dimensions, its capacity to capture more than just light and sound. What will you do now? Lucy asked me as the first sections of the Wellington's outer wall came down, revealing the skeletal framework beneath. I considered the question. After the theater's collapse, I had found myself at another crossroads, still broke, still haunted by my friend's death, but somehow lighter, as if resolving the Wellington's ancient grief had begun to heal my own. I'm going back to filmmaking, I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. Not Hollywood blockbusters or anything grandiose, but small stories, human stories, things that matter. Ryan smiled, the expression more genuine than I'd ever seen from him during our time at the theater. The emotional truth, not just the facts. Exactly. I watched as workers carried out debris from what had been Theater Number 5, ordinary building materials now, nothing mystical or hungry about them. What about you two? Lucy glanced at her sister, a familiar protective love in her eyes. I'm going back to school. Social work, maybe. Something that helps people process grief rather than preserve it. And I'm moving, Ryan said decisively. Somewhere coastal, with less history. Fewer old buildings. We laughed, the sound startlingly normal against the backdrop of destruction. As we watched, the crew began dismantling the facade around the main entrance, revealing something unexpected, a cornerstone I'd never noticed before, inscribed with words too distant to read. Curious, I approached closer, ignoring the warning shouts of workers. The inscription was weather-worn but still legible. Wellington Grand Theatre, established, 1932, where stories live forever. Below it, barely visible unless you knew to look, was a smaller line of text that sent a chill through me despite the warm spring day. T. Harlow and daughter, proprietors. T. Harlow, Theodore Harlow, the carnival owner mentioned in Margaret's journal. The originator of the mesmeric absorber of sorrows attraction that had eventually evolved into the entity within the Wellington Grand. And his daughter, the young Donna perhaps, at the beginning of her long, strange stewardship. A worker shouted at me to stand back as the cornerstone was pried loose. It tumbled to the ground with a heavy thud, cracking in two along a previously invisible seam. From within the broken stone, something fluttered out. A brittle, yellowed piece of paper. Before the workers could stop me, I snatched it up, unfolding it carefully to reveal a photograph. The image showed a carnival tent, circa 1880, according to the faded date stamp. Standing before it was a man in Victorian dress, presumably Theodore Harlow, and beside him, a young woman whose features struck me with shocking familiarity. Not Donna as I'd known her, but unmistakably her ancestor, or perhaps Donna herself, impossibly preserved across generations. She stared into the camera with knowing eyes, one hand resting possessively on a curtained booth bearing the sign, "Speak your sorrows, leave unburdened." I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded but elegant script, were words that made my blood run cold. The hunger moves ever westward, seeking new vessels for ancient appetites. What feeds on grief cannot be destroyed, only redirected. May those who read this prepare accordingly. Donna Harlow, 1932. I pocketed the photograph before rejoining Lucy and Ryan, deciding that some discoveries were better kept private. The Wellington Grand was gone. Its particular manifestation of hunger resolved. That was enough for now. As the last walls came down, revealing empty sky where the theater had stood for nearly a century, I found myself thinking not of Donna or the entity, but of Elaine and Catherine Reeves, mother and daughter, separated by tragedy, reunited through the strange alchemy of film and memory. Some griefs should be preserved, not as eternal monuments of suffering, but as testimonies to love's endurance. Some stories deserve to live forever, not trapped in loops of unresolved sorrow, but completed through understanding and acceptance. The Wellington Grand was dead, its hunger sated, its rules rendered meaningless. But somewhere, in spaces between frames that no projector could illuminate, I like to think that Elaine and Catherine walked together in perpetual sunlight. Their story finally allowed its proper ending. And in my pocket, a weathered photograph whispered of other theaters, other vessels, other hungers still waiting to be fed or freed. A warning, perhaps, or an invitation to continue what Margaret Ellington had begun. The documentation of cinema's stranger dimensions, its power to capture more than images, to contain more than stories. They say rock bottom is a myth, that you can always fall deeper, or at least trip on a loose stone while you're down there and faceplant into the mud. But sometimes, if you're lucky, you find that the ground beneath you holds forgotten treasures along with its dangers. fragments of truth that, when pieced together, show a path leading not just away from darkness, but towards something better than mere escape. As I walked away from the demolition site with Lucy and Ryan, leaving behind the dust and fragments of the Wellington Grand, I felt the weight of the photograph in my pocket, a reminder that some stories never truly end. They just pause between reels, waiting for the next projection to begin. That's the end of this story. If you enjoyed the video, subscribing to my channel would help me out more than you can imagine. I appreciate you, and I'll see you soon.